1. The murder of Lisa Holm, 16 Sweden, 2015. Lisa Holm was just 17 years old when she disappeared without a trace after stepping out of the cafe where she worked weekends. What began as a seemingly ordinary evening would quickly unravel into one of the most harrowing and high-profile cases in Sweden's recent history. Clue after disturbing clue began to surface, painting a chilling picture. Soon, the country was gripped by her disappearance, and more than 1,000 volunteers joined the largest search operation Sweden had ever seen. What they ultimately uncovered left the nation stunned. Lisa was born on February 7, 1998, in the small, peaceful town of Hoo, Sweden. She lived there with her parents and older sister in a quiet environment. Lisa was known for her kind nature, strong will, and positive spirit. She had already set her sights on the future, planning to study architecture in Australia after finishing school. Her passion for discovery extended beyond academics. She had traveled with her family to various countries and embraced independence from a young age. By the summer of 2015, Lisa had taken a step toward that independence. She secured her first serious job at a cafe about a 40-minute drive from her home. At first, her parents drove her back and forth, but once she got her scooter license, they gifted her a scooter, since Swedish law required her to wait until 18 for a car license. Lisa welcomed the freedom, though she was still new to driving. To ease the transition, her father followed her to work and back each day for a few weeks. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. She only worked weekends, and her father maintained that routine until June 7th, the first day he let Lisa drive herself without an escort. That afternoon, her parents stopped by the cafe for lunch. It was a busy day, and Lisa was juggling tasks behind the counter. She took a short break to share a snack with them before they returned home. At 6:23 p.m., Lisa texted her father to say she was leaving work, but just 3 minutes later, he received a phone call from her. When he picked up, no one spoke. Instead, he heard muffled voices in the background, perhaps Lisa talking to coworkers, and the sound of a car door slamming shut. Assuming she had pocket-dialed him by accident, he called out her name, got no response, and hung up, expecting she'd be home shortly. But Lisa never came home. An hour had passed, and Lisa still hadn't come home. Her parents began to worry. She should have arrived long ago. It was her first solo ride on the scooter, and her father couldn't shake the thought that something might have gone wrong on the road. He tried calling her several times, but each call went straight to voicemail. Lisa's phone was off. After a few more tense minutes, he couldn't sit still any longer. Grabbing his keys, he jumped into his car and headed out, hoping to meet her on the road. He drove slowly, scanning every stretch for signs of an accident or trouble. But Lisa was nowhere in sight. Eventually, he reached the cafe. There was no sign of his daughter, but her scooter was still parked right in front of the building. Panic started creeping in. He had just driven the entire route, and Lisa was nowhere along the way. Seeing the scooter briefly gave him hope. Maybe she was just finishing up something inside, but that relief vanished quickly. The cafe was empty. Even more troubling, the scooter's keys were still in the ignition, and her helmet was hanging from the handlebar. Something Lisa would never have left behind. She was responsible and cautious. Leaving her scooter like that, unattended, didn't make sense. Her father's worry turned to fear. Something wasn't right. At the same time, Lisa's mother called the cafe owner, hoping she might know where Lisa had gone. But the woman was just as confused. She hadn't seen Lisa. Around 6 p.m., she had checked in with her staff, who said they were closing for the day. Alarmed by the call, the cafe owner got in her car and drove straight to the location. On the way, she phoned 4 friends who lived nearby and asked them to join the search. When she arrived, she and Lisa's father began combing through the cafe and the surrounding area. Desperation was growing. One last possibility remained. Maybe Lisa had decided, for some reason, to take the bus home instead of using her scooter. Her mother and older sister checked the schedule and drove to the bus stop in their town, hoping she would appear. But the bus came and went. Lisa wasn't on it. That hope faded just like the daylight. It was nearly 10 p.m. now, and darkness had settled in. With no other leads, Lisa's family finally called the police. Police wasted no time launching an extensive search. The sight of Lisa's scooter abandoned in the cafe parking lot, keys still in the ignition, raised immediate red flags. It strongly suggested the possibility of an abduction. Such cases were rare in Sweden, especially in a quiet rural province like Lisa's hometown. Given the circumstances, authorities acted swiftly. Search teams with trained dogs were dispatched into the surrounding area, while other officers went door to door, speaking with residents near the cafe. Word of Lisa's disappearance quickly spread. Her classmates and friends began sharing posts across social media, hoping to draw attention to her case and reach potential witnesses. As the search stretched through the night, no concrete leads emerged. By Monday morning, police officially announced Lisa's disappearance to the public, urging anyone with information to come forward. That same day, a man working in a barn just across the road from the cafe made a discovery: a single motorcycle glove lying on the floor. He notified the police. Detectives had already searched that barn the night Lisa vanished, but had missed the glove. When they showed it to Lisa's parents, they immediately confirmed it was hers. The glove discovery reinforced the growing belief that Lisa had been abducted. In response, police ramped up their efforts, deploying even more resources. By this point, news of the case had spread nationwide. Volunteers began arriving by the hundreds, eager to help in any way they could. On Tuesday, new and unsettling evidence came to light. Volunteers searching along a dirt road just a few hundred yards from the cafe came across a series of personal items: a phone case, a receipt, a ticket, and part of a broken smartphone screen. Investigators quickly confirmed all of it belonged to Lisa. That stretch of road instantly became the new focal point of the search. Soon after, more items were found scattered nearby. Additional fragments of Lisa's phone, her ID, and several more receipts. All of it lay strewn across the same dirt path. At this point, the abduction theory was no longer just a possibility. It became the central focus of the investigation. Police intensified their efforts, bringing in all available units. As the case dominated national headlines, more and more people arrived to assist. What started as a local search ballooned into a massive national effort. Even a local volunteer organization known for locating missing persons joined the cause. In total, more than 1,000 people took part in the operation, making it the largest search effort in Sweden's modern history. As news of Lisa's disappearance continued to spread, police began receiving a steady stream of tips from the public. One in particular stood out. A woman called in to report a strange encounter she had experienced the day before Lisa went missing. She had been out for a jog when a man standing beside his parked car stopped her in the middle of the road. He spoke in English and asked for directions to a city she had never even heard of. Trying to be helpful, She pulled out her phone to show him the route on Google Maps, but the man insisted. He asked her to get into his car and input the destination directly into his GPS. Alarmed by the request, the woman declined and quickly ran off. What stuck with her, though, was the man's face. She told police she believed she had seen him before, working on the barn located just across the road from the cafe where Lisa had last been seen. Around the same time, Lisa's co-workers also came forward with a troubling memory. On the day she disappeared, one of them had noticed two men standing across the road from the cafe, watching the building. At the time, it hadn't seemed important, but after learning what had happened to Lisa, the witness decided to inform police. The next morning, Wednesday, Lisa's father and several friends returned to the dirt road where her belongings had previously been found. Determined to search every inch, they walked farther along the route. That's when Lisa's father made another disturbing discovery: her driver's license and house keys lying by the roadside. It appeared as though someone had been driving away from the cafe, discarding her personal items along the way. Following these finds, police and volunteers focused all efforts on the area. Despite the renewed push, no further evidence turned up that day. But that evening brought another breakthrough, thanks to a friend of Lisa's father. On his way home from the day's search, he drove past the cafe and noticed that the police tape had been removed from the barn where Lisa's glove had been discovered days earlier. Something told him to take one more look. Grabbing a flashlight from his car, he stepped inside. It was already growing dark, and he slowly made his way through the dim interior. After a few minutes, something shiny on the ground caught his attention. When he got closer, he realized it was a woman's earring, and then spotted a matching one nearby. He immediately contacted the police. Investigators showed the earrings to Lisa's parents, who confirmed that they belonged to their daughter. Following the discovery of Lisa's earrings, police once again sealed off the barn and launched a far more thorough search. The lead detective later explained that during the initial stages of the investigation, the priority had been to locate Lisa herself. As a result, the barn was only briefly inspected, and smaller items, like the earrings, may have been overlooked. This time, they weren't taking any chances. Forensic specialists and search dogs were brought in to comb through every inch of the structure. During the search, investigators came across an unusual piece of evidence behind one of the walls: human feces. At first glance, it didn't seem significant, but the forensic team had a different view. They proposed a theory based on behavioral patterns observed in violent offenders. When individuals commit extremely serious or traumatic crimes, their bodies often experience a surge of adrenaline. This intense stress response can trigger involuntary physical reactions, including the urgent need to relieve themselves. In fact, experts noted it's not uncommon for perpetrators to urinate or defecate before or during a murder. Given the fact that Lisa's glove and earrings had already been found in this barn, detectives began to suspect that the perpetrator might have brought her there during the abduction. If so, the feces might have been left behind by the suspect during the height of the crime. Investigators collected the sample and sent it for DNA testing. By Friday, the search effort expanded to cover a broader area. Volunteers made their way to a farm complex located about 2 miles from the cafe. The site consisted of several large buildings where many people worked, and the search team intended to check each one. Shortly after the team arrived, 2 men appeared at the farm. They didn't speak Swedish and communicated only in English. One of them told the group that the police had already searched the area, but the team leader wasn't convinced. If a search had taken place, he believed he would have been informed. He chose to continue. The two men lingered around the property for a while, quietly observing the volunteers as they moved through the grounds. Eventually, without further interaction, they got back in their vehicle and left. About an hour later, members of the search team made another discovery, this time behind the cowshed on the farm. Hidden beneath a pile of branches, they found a motorcycle helmet, a jacket, and a pair of headphones. Police were immediately called to the scene. Upon arrival, investigators confirmed the items all belonged to Lisa. Forensic experts were dispatched to the farm without delay, and the site was designated for a full-scale search. In the meantime, detectives were briefed on the two strange men who had earlier tried to discourage volunteers from inspecting the area. The story raised immediate red flags. Investigators recalled a similar report, one involving a woman who had been approached by a suspicious English-speaking man during a jog. They began connecting the dots and realized they might already have a lead. Early in the investigation, police had conducted house-to-house checks in the area around the cafe. Just a few miles away, they came across a home occupied by two brothers from Lithuania and the wife of one of them. None of the three spoke Swedish. They communicated exclusively in English. In fact, they were the only non-Swedish speakers living in the area. There were also other details that made them persons of interest. The two men worked in both the barn across from the cafe, where Lisa's glove and earrings had been found, and at the same farm where her helmet had now turned up. They knew the layout of both locations, and notably, the dirt road where Lisa's scattered belongings had been discovered led directly toward their home. With no other viable suspects, police made the decision to bring all three in for questioning. Meanwhile, forensic teams continued their search of the farm, joined by volunteers. While canvassing the grounds, their attention shifted to an old trailer tucked away in the tall grass. It looked weathered, unused, forgotten. But something about it stood out. Near the trailer's door, the grass was visibly flattened, as though something, or someone, had been lying there recently. Even more telling, blades of grass were caught under the doorframe, suggesting it had been opened not long ago. When investigators pulled the door open, they were immediately hit by a strong and unmistakable odor, the smell of decay. Inside the trailer, investigators found a row of metal lockers, likely remnants from when the structure had been used as a changing room for workers. Nearly all of the lockers were locked shut, except for one. That detail immediately caught the attention of the forensic team. They feared the worst. As they began opening each locker, methodically working their way down the line, their fears were confirmed. Inside the one unlocked locker, partially hidden beneath a pile of old clothes and dirty rags, they discovered Lisa's body. Though the space was small, the perpetrator had managed to force her inside. A rope was tied tightly around her neck, and her head was wrapped in layers of tape. Her pants had been pulled down, her shirt pulled up. Despite the position of her clothing, medical examiners later determined there were no signs of sexual assault. The cause of death was strangulation. All of Lisa's clothing was collected and sent to the lab for further analysis. As word of the discovery spread, it sent shockwaves across Sweden. Lisa's disappearance had already been dominating national headlines for days. But now, with confirmation of her brutal murder, the public reaction turned to grief and disbelief. Violent crimes of this nature were extremely rare in Sweden, especially in small rural towns. The senselessness and cruelty of the act stunned the nation. Later that same day, something strange and unsettling surfaced online. A few YouTube users stumbled across a video titled 13, which had been uploaded exactly 13 days before Lisa's body was found. The video itself was little more than a countdown timer, but what disturbed people most was the name of the channel that posted it: Lisa Holm. The bizarre coincidence quickly caught the media's attention. Speculation ran wild. Was this a sinister prediction? A taunt? But as investigators looked into it, the explanation turned out to be far less mysterious. Someone had changed the name of the YouTube channel and the video title after Lisa's murder had become public. Whether it was an attempt to fuel conspiracy theories or just a cruel prank, it left many feeling deeply unsettled. While the discovery of Lisa's body stunned the nation, police were moving quickly behind the scenes to find her killer. By the time her remains were found, investigators had already brought in 3 individuals for questioning: 2 brothers from Lithuania and the wife of one of them. All 3 denied any involvement. They claimed that during the time of Lisa's abduction, they were at home, each providing an alibi for the other. According to their statements, the older brother, 35-year-old Norris, was asleep in his room. His wife was in the kitchen preparing dinner, and the younger brother was using the computer. Norris also added that around 8 p.m., he woke up and drove to a nearby gas station where he bought pizza and cigarettes. Investigators were skeptical. The alibis came solely from within the household, and it was entirely possible the trio had agreed to cover for one another. Police collected DNA samples from all 3, but at that point, they had no physical evidence directly linking any of them to the crime. That would soon change. Forensic teams were still combing the barn and the surrounding farm with every resource at their disposal. Their persistence finally paid off. Inside the barn, tucked away in a small room that resembled an office, investigators found something deeply disturbing. The room featured a large window overlooking the cafe, clearly offering a full view of the employees working inside, including Lisa. On the floor and walls near the window, forensic specialists discovered 15 separate traces of male semen. The pattern suggested someone had spent time standing there, watching the cafe and masturbating. The samples were rushed to the lab. DNA testing confirmed all 15 samples belonged to Norris, the older brother. The feces previously found in the barn, also his. In a separate room once used for storing cow's milk, investigators noticed something odd. A pipe mounted about 2 feet above the ground was coated in a thick layer of dust, except for one narrow strip that had been recently disturbed. Its shape matched the rope used to strangle Lisa. Blood was also found on the pipe. DNA testing confirmed what investigators had feared. The blood belonged to Lisa, and the connection to Norris was no longer circumstantial. Beneath the pipe where Lisa's blood had been discovered, investigators found yet another critical piece of evidence: a section of rope identical to the one used to strangle her. Forensic analysis revealed 2 DNA profiles on the rope, Lisa's and Norris's. It was a pivotal breakthrough. At last, police had physical evidence linking Norris directly to the murder weapon. The evidence didn't stop there. A strand of Lisa's hair was also recovered from the floor of the same room, further supporting the theory that she had died in that very spot. Meanwhile, her jacket, recovered earlier near the cowshed, contained traces of Norris's DNA as well. With the mounting forensic evidence, investigators were able to piece together an approximate sequence of events. They believed Norris had been watching the cafe from the small office inside the barn for some time, likely observing Lisa during her shifts. When she left work that evening and stood alone in the parking lot, he made his move. Based on the jogger's earlier report, it's likely he approached Lisa and asked for directions, perhaps to a city she didn't recognize, and then requested her help entering the location into his GPS. Given Lisa's kind and helpful nature, it's possible she agreed to assist him. Once she was inside his vehicle, investigators believe Norris subdued her, likely taping her mouth to silence her, and then drove her to the barn. There, he used the rope to hang her from the pipe, ultimately killing her by strangulation. According to forensic experts, the intense rush of adrenaline during the act may have caused him to lose control of his bodily functions, which could explain the human feces found nearby. After Lisa died, Norris is believed to have placed her body in his vehicle and driven to the nearby farm. Along the way, he discarded her belongings, phone, ID, receipts, out the window. At the farm, he concealed her body inside the old trailer locker, covering it with discarded clothing. From the moment of her abduction to the concealment of her body, police estimate the entire crime took less than an hour. Despite the overwhelming forensic evidence, Norris continued to deny any involvement. With no evidence implicating the other two, his wife and younger brother were released. Almost immediately after their release, the pair left Sweden and returned to Lithuania. As the trial approached, the stakes were high and preparations intense. Norris maintained his innocence, claiming that his DNA was only present in the barn because he had worked there for an extended period. He also pointed to the alibi provided by his wife and younger brother, both of whom insisted he had been home during the time of the abduction. However, investigators remained skeptical, viewing those accounts as potentially coordinated and unreliable. Initially, those explanations might have held some weight in court. But there was one detail that couldn't be explained away so easily: the presence of Norris's DNA on Lisa's clothing. This, investigators argued, could only have come from direct contact with her on the day of the murder. Adding to the case against him, police identified a witness who reported seeing Norris's vehicle near the cafe shortly before and after Lisa disappeared. According to the witness, the car had been seen multiple times driving along the road connecting the cafe and the nearby farm, precisely when Norris was supposedly asleep at home, according to his alibi. In the months that followed the discovery of Lisa's body, forensic experts continued examining every piece of evidence using the most advanced technology available. Eventually, they made a devastating find. Norris's DNA was present on nearly all of Lisa's clothing, including inside her underwear. The case continued to grip the country. With national attention still focused on the investigation, detectives pushed even harder to find any additional evidence that could bolster the prosecution. They traveled to Lithuania to re-interview Norris's wife and younger brother. Once again, his wife stuck to her story. She claimed that Norris had not left the house at any point between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. But when it came time to speak with the younger brother, the investigation took a turn. Detectives laid out all the forensic evidence, step by step. What had been found, how it connected to Norris, and what Lisa had endured. Faced with the overwhelming proof, the younger brother broke. He chose to talk. And with that, the truth began to emerge. The younger brother's confession brought crucial clarity to the timeline. He told investigators that Norris had not been home during the evening of Lisa's disappearance. In fact, he only returned around 7:30 p.m., covered in dirt. As soon as he walked through the door, Norris went straight to the washing machine and threw in all his clothes. Shortly after, when police began going door to door questioning residents, Norris leaned in and quietly told his brother, "Tell them I was home at that time." Later, Norris claimed he had panicked. He said he feared being blamed for a crime he hadn't committed, because he was an immigrant and had no alibi. His younger brother admitted he initially believed that explanation, But once he learned the full extent of the evidence, he realized the truth. A month after Lisa's murder, her funeral was held. The church could only hold 130 people, but that didn't stop the crowd. Mourners came from all over, far exceeding the venue's capacity. Organizers set up benches and large video screens outside, allowing everyone a chance to say goodbye. 4 months after her death, the trial began. The case once again gripped the nation. With so much public attention, everyone involved, from investigators to prosecutors to the defense, faced immense pressure. There was no room for error. Norris's attorney argued that his client's DNA might have ended up on Lisa's clothing simply because he had worked in the barn. But the prosecution quickly dismantled that claim. The presence of his DNA inside Lisa's underwear, they argued, could only be explained by direct and intimate contact. Work-related transfer didn't apply here. When pressed, the defense had no alternative explanation. No other solid evidence or testimony was offered to support Norris's innocence. At one point during the trial, Norris's defense attempted a last-ditch strategy, shifting the blame onto his younger brother. The theory suggested that the brother had somehow collected multiple samples of Norris's DNA, then planted them both on Lisa's body and throughout the crime scene. But the court wasn't convinced. The defense failed to explain how such a complex manipulation could be carried out without detection, and the claim quickly lost credibility. The trial lasted a month. In the end, the evidence left little room for doubt. Norris was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Given that this was Sweden, his punishment came with a caveat. His facility bore more resemblance to a modest 3-star hotel than a typical high-security prison. His lawyer filed an appeal, but it was promptly denied. Then, in early 2017, Norris made a surprising request. He asked to be deported and transferred to a prison in his native Lithuania. The reasons behind the move weren't clear. Lithuanian prisons were known to be far less comfortable than their Swedish counterparts. Still, the court granted the transfer, perhaps in part because housing an inmate in Sweden cost taxpayers hundreds of dollars per day. Later that year, his real motive came to light. Once in Lithuania, Norris appealed to a local court. To the shock of many, his sentence was reduced from life imprisonment to 15 years, but the victory was short-lived. Just weeks later, the decision was overturned, and his life sentence was reinstated. This time with no chance of returning to Sweden and its relatively lenient conditions. 5 years passed. Then, in August 2022, Norris faced the harsh reality of his new environment. During an inmate transfer within the prison, he was attacked by another prisoner with a homemade shank. The injuries were severe. Norris died en route to the hospital. As for Norris's wife, questions about her role in the case still linger. While investigators have found virtually no evidence pointing to her direct involvement in Lisa's abduction or murder, her DNA was absent from all of Lisa's belongings and clothing. They haven't entirely ruled her out. What remains a possibility is that she knew what her husband had done and helped him avoid justice by providing a false alibi. Suspicion also surrounds Norris's younger brother. Several cafe employees reported seeing 2 men standing near the barn and watching them in the hours before Lisa vanished. If one of those men was Norris, it's likely the second was his brother. Yet despite this sighting, the younger brother's DNA was never found, neither in the barn nor on Lisa's clothing, making his direct involvement in the crime unlikely. It's possible that both brothers had been observing the young staff at the cafe, maybe even engaging in inappropriate conversation or behavior. But when it came to action, it appears that only Norris crossed the line, acting alone in carrying out the horrific crime that shocked an entire nation. 2. The abduction and murder of Gretchen Harrington, USA, 1975. Gretchen Harrington was born on June 13, 1967, in Pennsylvania. The youngest of 3 daughters, she joined a close-knit family grounded in faith and community. Not long after her birth, the Harringtons relocated to the small town of Broomall, where her father accepted a position as pastor at the local church. Gretchen quickly grew to love Broomall. It was the kind of town where children played freely outdoors until dusk, and neighbors looked out for one another. With its peaceful streets, lush greenery, and strong sense of community, it felt like an ideal place to grow up, almost idyllic. Raised in a devout household, Gretchen spent much of her time at church, often by her father's side. She was bright and well-behaved, earning top marks in Sunday school and taking pride in her perfect attendance. On the morning of August 15, 1975, 8-year-old Gretchen was excited. Her mother was returning home from the hospital that day with a newborn baby sister. Gretchen wanted to stay and welcome them, but her father encouraged her not to miss Sunday school, a reminder of how much her performance mattered to her. She agreed, somewhat reluctantly, grabbed her Bible, and set off. Normally, Gretchen walked to church with her older sisters, but that morning, both girls stayed home. Still, she wasn't worried. The walk to Trinity Church was short, just under a mile, about 8 minutes on foot. That day's Sunday school routine followed the usual schedule. Children would first gather at Trinity Church, and after about 90 minutes, some of them would be escorted to the second church, where Gretchen's father preached. But when the children arrived at his church around 11:30 a.m., he noticed something odd. Gretchen wasn't with them. Since the group always arrived together, it immediately raised concern. Assuming she might have stayed behind at Trinity, he called over to check. The phone was answered by the wife of Pastor David, who also taught Sunday school. She told him Gretchen wasn't there. When she relayed the call to her husband, he too was surprised. Gretchen hadn't shown up for class that morning at all. Gretchen's father immediately felt a sense of dread. Something wasn't right. He asked Pastor David to call the police while he rushed out to search for his daughter himself. He drove the route between the 2 churches, checked the surrounding streets, and circled the neighborhood. But there was no sign of Gretchen. Desperate, he began calling the parents of her friends, hoping she may have stopped by to see someone. But they were all either at home or already at church. Even David's own daughter, Gretchen's best friend, said she hadn't seen her at all that day. Police responded quickly. As word of Gretchen's disappearance spread through Broomall, the entire community mobilized. Hundreds of volunteers stepped forward to help. Nearly everyone in town knew Gretchen's father from church, and they were eager to support the search. Working side by side with police, volunteers fanned out across the area. They combed through streets, searched wooded areas, and walked along the riverbank. A helicopter was brought in to assist from the air, scanning fields and forests in case Gretchen had wandered off, or worse. But as the hours passed and daylight faded, there was still no trace of her. By the next morning, even more people had joined the effort. Police printed and distributed flyers bearing Gretchen's photo and disappearance details. They were posted along roads, handed out to passing drivers, anything to raise awareness. Yet despite the growing scope of the search, authorities had no answers. Gretchen hadn't been found, and there were no solid leads to explain what had happened to her. As the days wore on, the mood in Broomall shifted from anxious to heartbroken. The town was shaken. For years, Children had played outside freely, wandering the woods, swimming in the river, riding bikes until sundown, without a second thought. It had always been safe here. Parents never felt the need to hover. Now, that sense of security was gone. And the most haunting part of it all, no one knew what had happened to Gretchen. That uncertainty only deepened the fear. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. As days passed without answers, the town began to speculate. Some residents believed Gretchen might have run away from home, though those who knew her well doubted it. Others thought she may have gone swimming in the river and drowned. But the most unsettling theory, the one no one wanted to believe, was that someone had abducted her. That possibility changed everything. Parents who once let their children roam freely now kept them within arm's reach. Playdates moved indoors. One local mother even cut her daughter's long hair short, hoping she might be mistaken for a boy and spared from harm. Practically overnight, Broomall transformed from a quiet, trusting town into a community gripped by fear and suspicion. Meanwhile, police worked around the clock, interviewing anyone who might have had even the slightest connection to Gretchen's disappearance. Several leads emerged. One witness reported seeing a young girl matching Gretchen's description near the church that morning. A green station wagon pulled up beside her, but the witness didn't see what happened next. Another person came forward with a similar account, though in this version, the car was a white Cadillac. Detectives pursued both leads, tracking down the owners of all matching vehicles in the area. But nothing came of it. None could be linked to Gretchen or the events of that day. Then, 4 days after her disappearance, a call came in from a resident in Westchester, a town about 30 minutes away. He reported finding a pair of children's shorts that looked like the ones Gretchen had been wearing. Investigators rushed to the scene and showed the shorts to Gretchen's mother, but after looking them over, she confirmed they weren't her daughter's. From that point on, the case grew cold. The large-scale search operation was called off, and police turned their full attention to the investigation. They continued to question residents, chase down tips, and review every possible scenario. But with each passing day, the hope of finding Gretchen alive began to fade. Weeks turned into months. Then, on October 14th, 2 months after Gretchen vanished, a chilling phone call came into the police department. On October 14th, a man was out for a jog in a large national park, roughly 20 minutes outside Broomall. As he moved along a wooded trail, something unusual caught his eye in the bushes. At first, he couldn't make sense of what he was seeing. But as he stepped closer, the horrifying truth came into focus. It was a human body. Shaken, he ran straight to the nearest park ranger station and reported the discovery. Rangers quickly contacted the local authorities. When police arrived, it became immediately clear the remains were those of a child. But the body was badly decomposed, making identification extremely difficult. Still, detectives feared the worst. Given the timing and location, they suspected it might be Gretchen. Next to the body, investigators found clothing, neatly folded, as if placed there with care. Photos of the garments were shown to Gretchen's parents in hopes of a positive ID. Her mother didn't hesitate. She recognized the items instantly. She had sewn them herself. Forensic examiners soon confirmed what the family already knew. Using dental records, they identified the remains as Gretchen Harrington. The medical examiner concluded that she had died from multiple blunt force injuries to the head. The case was officially reclassified as a homicide. Unfortunately, The advanced stage of decomposition left investigators with little else to go on. There was no way to determine whether Gretchen had been sexually assaulted, and with no DNA testing available in 1975, there were no biological clues to follow. News of Gretchen's murder devastated the community all over again. What had begun as a missing child case was now a confirmed killing, and with the killer still at large, fear and outrage spread quickly. Tips began pouring into the police station. Everyone wanted justice. Detectives received dozens of reports about suspicious men seen in or around the park where Gretchen's body had been found. But one by one, those leads dried up. Each turned out to be another dead end. Investigators left no stone unturned. They ran background checks on every individual living within a few-mile radius who had any history of violent crimes. But once again, the effort came up empty. Months passed after the discovery of Gretchen's body, and with no solid leads or physical evidence, the case came to a standstill. Over the years, the investigation was reopened several times. Detectives re-examined old tips, revisited witnesses, and followed every thread they could find. But each time, it led nowhere. The core problem remained unchanged. There was no physical evidence to work with. Even when DNA analysis became available years later, it did little to help. No foreign DNA was recovered from Gretchen's remains or clothing. There was nothing to test. And so, the case remained unsolved for decades. Though it occasionally resurfaced in newspaper columns or on television specials, it largely faded from the public's focus. Until recently, when the murder of Gretchen Harrington captured widespread attention once again. Two journalists, Joanna and Mike, decided to take a deeper look. Both had grown up in Broomall, and they spent several years meticulously researching the case, gathering documents, interviews, and any fragments of new information they could find. Their goal? To write a book that would bring renewed awareness to Gretchen's story, and perhaps uncover something that had been missed. For Joanna, the story was personal. She had been just 9 years old when Gretchen disappeared, and she remembered it vividly. The shock of that summer stayed with her. Gretchen's murder hadn't just shaken one family, it had changed the entire town. After Gretchen vanished, children were no longer allowed to roam freely. Parents began walking their kids to school, keeping them close at all times. The carefree innocence of childhood had been replaced by quiet fear. Even the youngest children felt it, that something had changed, and life in Broomall would never be the same. And because of that, they never forgot Gretchen. To write their book, Joanna and Mike gained access to the original case files and conducted interviews with many people connected to Gretchen's disappearance. Over time, they carefully reconstructed the events surrounding the case, assembling a detailed account of that summer in 1975. The book was published in 2022 and immediately reignited public interest in the long, cold case. But its most significant impact came months later, when a woman reached out to the police with a story she had kept to herself for decades. She met privately with the lead detective and explained that she had been just 10 years old at the time of Gretchen's murder. She lived in a nearby town, not far from Broomall, and was friends with Gretchen, her older sisters, and many other kids in the community. Like many children in the area, she frequently had sleepovers with friends. But one night, during a stay at the home of two sisters, something deeply disturbing happened. She awoke in the middle of the night to find someone touching her. When she opened her eyes, she saw the girl's father standing over her. He quickly left the room. Frightened and confused, she didn't say anything at first and stayed there another night. But the same thing happened again. The father entered the bedroom while she slept and began touching her. The next morning, she finally confided in one of the sisters. To her shock, the girl responded as if it were normal. She said it happened often, and that sometimes their father went into her sister's room at night too. When the girl returned home, she told her own parents what had happened, but rather than contacting the authorities, they simply forbade her from going back to that house. This all occurred just 1 week before Gretchen Harrington disappeared. After sharing her story with detectives, the woman revealed the name of the man who had abused her decades earlier. It was David Zanstra, the very same pastor who had taught Sunday school the morning Gretchen disappeared. But her account didn't end there. She went on to describe another disturbing incident that occurred just a month after Gretchen vanished. One of her friends, she said, had twice been approached by a man who tried to lure her into his car. Fortunately, the girl refused to go with him. Later, she confided in her friends, saying she believed the man who tried to abduct her was also David Zanstra. To support her claims, the woman brought forward a powerful piece of evidence: her childhood diary. On a dated entry from September 15, 1975, she had written about her friend's terrifying encounter and her plea to keep it a secret, out of fear that David Zanstra might come after her. With this new information in hand, police immediately reopened the case. As detectives revisited the original case files, several troubling details began to surface, clues that had gone unnoticed or unconnected for decades. One of them involved Zanstra's early involvement in the investigation. He was the one who had initially reported Gretchen missing to the police. At the time, he gave investigators an unusually detailed description of what she had been wearing: dark blue zip-up shorts with studs and front pockets, no zippers or buttons, along with a white top and braided hair. But according to his own account, he claimed he hadn't seen Gretchen that morning. That contradiction raised a serious red flag. If he hadn't seen her, how could he have described her clothing with such precision? And after her remains were found, his description proved to be entirely accurate. Gretchen had been wearing exactly what he described. There was more. Investigators learned that Sunday school on the morning of August 15th had started almost 50 minutes late. Zanstra hadn't arrived at church on time. This delay suggested a chilling possibility. He may have had the opportunity to intercept Gretchen on her way to church, abduct and murder her, then drive to the park to dispose of her body before returning to begin the day's lessons. Back in 1975, David Zanstra told police he had driven some of the children from Trinity Church to Gretchen's father's church after Sunday school. He insisted he hadn't seen Gretchen that morning and only realized she was missing when her father mentioned it. But new details painted a different picture. Not long after Gretchen's disappearance, Zanstra and his wife quietly relocated with their 3 children to another state. Investigators also learned that Zanstra owned multiple vehicles at the time, including a green station wagon, matching the description of a car seen near the church the morning Gretchen vanished. With mounting suspicion, detectives made the decision to confront him. In July 2023, they traveled to Georgia, where Zanstra, now 83, was living. On July 17th, they brought him to a local police station for questioning. At first, Zanstra denied everything, demanding to know what evidence they had. But when investigators presented witness statements, including testimony from a woman who said he molested her during a sleepover, and another accusation involving his own daughters, his demeanor shifted. The denial stopped. After 48 years, Zanstra finally began to talk. He confessed that on the morning of August 15, 1975, He was driving his green station wagon to church when he saw Gretchen leaving her home. He waited until no one was around, then pulled up and offered her a ride. Gretchen, who knew him well and trusted him, he was, after all, the family's pastor, got into the car without hesitation. But instead of driving to church, Zandstra took her to a remote area of a nearby park. There, he told her to take off her clothes. When Gretchen refused and said she wanted to go home, he struck her multiple times in the head until she lost consciousness. Zandstra admitted he then removed her clothing and sexually assaulted her. Afterward, realizing she no longer had a pulse, he drove to a different section of the park, carried her body into the woods, and covered it with branches. Then he returned to the church as if nothing had happened and began his Sunday school lessons. Following his confession, Zandstra was arrested for the murder of Gretchen Harrington and extradited back to Pennsylvania, where he now sits in jail awaiting trial. But for investigators, the arrest was only the beginning. Zandstra had spent decades working as a pastor in various towns and states. He often held trusted positions in churches and communities, frequently working with children. Now, detectives fear Gretchen may not have been his only victim. They collected his DNA and began comparing it to evidence from other unsolved cases. They also started reviewing cold cases involving missing girls from areas where Zandstra had lived and worked. It didn't take long to uncover a chilling possibility. In 1991, 4-year-old Amanda Campbell vanished from her California neighborhood. She had simply walked out of her house and was never seen again. At the time of her disappearance, David Zandstra was working as a pastor in that very same neighborhood. While no physical evidence yet links him to Amanda's case, investigators say the parallels are hard to ignore, and they continue to explore potential connections. As of now, the trial for Gretchen's murder has not begun. Given Zandstra's age and the seriousness of the charges, his legal team may attempt to delay the proceedings or even advise him to recant his confession. If that happens, the trial could be dragged out for years, raising the possibility that he may never face a final verdict. But one thing is certain. After nearly 5 decades, the truth about what happened to Gretchen Harrington has finally come to light. And the investigation into David Zandstra is far from over. 3. The cold case of Candace, Candy Rogers, USA, 1959. Candace Rogers, known to everyone as Candy, was born on July 18, 1949, in Spokane, Washington. She was the only child in her family. Not long after her birth, her parents separated, but her father remained in Spokane, allowing them to stay close and spend time together regularly. Candy was a bright, kind-hearted girl who loved the outdoors. She spent hours outside with her friends, exploring nature and playing with her beloved dog. Like many girls her age at the time, she dreamed of joining the Camp Fire Girls, a popular organization similar to the Boy Scouts, but for girls. The group focused on outdoor activities, practical skills, and community involvement. In 1959, when Candy was 9 years old, that dream came true. She officially became a Camp Fire Girl, and she was thrilled. One of the group's key activities was selling mints to raise funds. The girls were given boxes of sweets and assigned specific streets to canvass, going door to door to offer them to neighbors. It was a structured effort, carefully planned to avoid overlapping routes. On Friday, March 6th, after school, Candy was scheduled to sell her mints. She came home, had dinner, played with her dog, and around 4 p.m., she grabbed about 8 boxes and headed out. Her plan was simple: walk the nearby streets and offer the treats to familiar neighbors. But as the hours passed, and daylight began to fade, her mother started to worry. Candy was supposed to be home by 6 p.m., but there was still no sign of her. With growing concern, her mother and Candy's grandfather set out to look for her. They walked the streets of their neighborhood, retracing the likely paths Candy would have taken, but she was nowhere to be found. Soon, neighbors and family friends joined the effort, combing the area on foot. Despite their best efforts, not a single trace of Candy turned up. That night, her mother made the call no parent ever wants to make. She contacted the police and reported her daughter missing. By the time darkness settled over Spokane, the sense of unease had deepened. It was becoming increasingly clear that something was seriously wrong. The police joined the search quickly, beginning with door-to-door questioning of neighbors in the area. Early on, they learned that Candy had only managed to sell 1 box of mints. That suggested something may have happened to her shortly after she set out. Still, one resident reported something curious. They claimed to have seen Candy on a nearby street around 6:30 p.m., nearly half an hour after she was supposed to be home, and during the time her mother and grandfather were already out searching for her. Candy's grandfather had his own unsettling account. While walking that same street, he was nearly struck by a car that sped around the corner and even jumped the curb. He didn't catch the license plate, but he did remember the make and color, a green 1953 Ford. Police circulated a description of the vehicle, but it yielded no leads. Then, around 9 p.m., officers discovered several boxes of mints scattered along the road near a bridge. They were easily identified as Candy's. The discovery escalated concerns, suggesting she may have been taken, or worse, somewhere near that spot. Police concentrated their search in that area, scouring both sides of the riverbank and combing through the adjacent wooded sections. Officers and volunteers continued searching throughout the night, but there was no sign of the missing girl. By morning, news of Candy's disappearance had spread rapidly. Local newspapers covered the story, and soon it reached statewide media. In 1959, a child vanishing near her own neighborhood was an extremely rare event. Spokane hadn't faced anything like it in years, and the community was shaken. The next day, authorities ramped up their response. More officers were deployed, along with mounted police, off-road vehicles, and even military personnel who joined the search from the air via helicopter. Volunteers flooded in from Spokane and nearby towns, eager to help. In total, more than 1,000 people joined the effort, making it one of the largest search operations in the country at the time. The area being searched extended across an 11-mile radius from Candy's home. And yet, despite all of it, there was still no sign of her. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. That same day, tragedy struck again. One of the helicopters assisting in the search clipped a set of power lines and crashed. Of the 5 crew members on board, 3 lost their lives. The news devastated the already shaken community and underscored the seriousness and scope of the effort to find Candy. Despite the dangers, the search pushed on for days, but no new signs of Candy emerged. Police officers worked around the clock in rotating shifts, determined to bring her home. In just the first few days, investigators received nearly 750 tips. Each was thoroughly checked, but none led to Candy. The case seemed to be growing colder by the hour. Then, 15 days after her disappearance, a break came. By chance. 2 military servicemen from a nearby base were hunting in the woods west of Spokane when they noticed something unusual on the forest floor: a pair of small children's shoes. Both men had helped in the search for Candy and immediately recognized the potential significance. They notified police. The shoes were shown to Candy's grandfather. He didn't hesitate. They belonged to his granddaughter. Police mobilized and launched a search of the wooded area. It didn't take long. Within minutes, an officer spotted a small foot protruding from the underbrush. It was Candy. Her body was found beneath a layer of pine branches, concealed in a shallow spot among the trees. The medical examiner determined that she had been strangled with a torn piece of fabric, later identified as part of her own skirt. Injuries to her wrists and ankles showed she had been bound, though no restraints were found at the scene. The examination also revealed the heartbreaking truth that Candy had been sexually assaulted. Nearby, officers recovered a green car seat cover. Though suspicious, they couldn't confirm whether it was connected to the murder. On Candy's clothing, they noted a small purple stain that emitted a faint smell. Grape-flavored chewing gum, possibly. But once again, it was a clue that went nowhere. Despite the body being found and the cause of death confirmed, investigators were left with no viable leads. They continued searching, desperately, hoping to uncover anything that could point them to Candy's killer. Investigators worked tirelessly, following up on an overwhelming number of tips. They looked into neighbors, drifters, known predators, and anyone with a criminal record who might have crossed paths with Candy. As the days passed, the list of persons of interest continued to grow. Before long, attention turned to a 50-year-old man named Alfred Graves, and the reason he became a suspect was unsettling. On the same day Candy's body was discovered, Graves took his own life inside his car. The location was particularly troubling. It was near the spot where Candy's mint boxes had been found. Even more concerning, Graves lived just a few hundred yards from Candy's home. When officers searched his vehicle, they found a length of rope and women's hairpins. That prompted a search of his house, where detectives uncovered a disturbing collection of newspaper clippings, all focused on sexual crimes against women and girls. Several women had previously accused him of harassment, and even his own wife admitted she had long suspected him in Candy's disappearance. Despite the red flags, investigators couldn't find any concrete evidence linking Graves to Candy's murder. There were no physical traces, no witnesses, and no confession. While they couldn't confidently clear him, they also couldn't prove he was the killer. The case didn't stop there. Detectives continued working through an ever-growing list of suspects. By the end of that year, the file spanned multiple pages, each name carefully reviewed and investigated. But time and again, the leads ran cold. Eventually, another name caught their attention. Hugh Morris, a man later arrested in 1961 for a series of violent crimes. Two factors made him a compelling suspect. First, Morris was known for constantly chewing grape-flavored gum, a detail eerily similar to the grape-scented purple stain found on Candy's clothing. Second, he had murdered 2 women in Spokane just months after Candy's death. It was enough to raise suspicion, but once again, police lacked the evidence to make an arrest. Hugh Morris had a long and disturbing history that began early in life. His first arrest was for assaulting a woman, but instead of facing serious consequences, he was simply discharged from the army, where he had been serving at the time. Not long after, he committed a series of robberies in Los Angeles. For that, he served just 6 months behind bars. After his release, Morris lured 2 8-year-old girls to a secluded location by offering them ice cream. He was arrested again, but remarkably, he once more avoided prison. A medical board ruled that he was a sexual psychopath, and instead of jail time, he was committed to a psychiatric facility. 2 years later, doctors deemed him cured and released him. He moved to Spokane, where his behavior quickly escalated. He began peering into women's windows, and by November 1959, just months after Candy Rogers was killed, he broke into the home of a 28-year-old woman, assaulted her, and left her dead. 10 months later, he did the same to another woman. Then, a month after that, he attacked a third victim, this time stabbing her repeatedly. She survived. After that last assault, Morris fled the area and went on a crime spree across multiple states. His violence escalated, and the FBI eventually added him to its 10 most wanted list. He was captured soon after and ultimately received multiple life sentences. Detectives working Candy's case visited Morris in prison, hoping to get answers. But he denied any involvement in Candy's murder and agreed to take a polygraph test, which he passed. Still, investigators were cautious. Polygraph results aren't admissible in court and are far from foolproof. Despite Morris's violent history and his presence in Spokane at the time of Candy's death, there was no physical evidence tying him to the crime. Later, investigators turned their attention to another potential suspect, 49-year-old Howard Barnett. In February 1960, just months after Candy's body was found, Barnett was arrested on suspicion of assaulting a minor. Days later, he died by suicide in his jail cell. Before his death, Barnett scrawled a haunting message on the wall in his own blood. "I have a sin before the Lord." When police informed his wife of his death, her immediate response was chilling. "Did he kill that girl?" she asked, referring without hesitation to Candy Rogers. Detectives launched a full investigation into Howard Barnett's potential connection to Candy's murder. He remained one of their primary suspects, largely because he lived just one street over from the Rogers family. But once again, despite their efforts, investigators couldn't find any solid evidence linking him to the crime. Over the years, the case remained active in some form, with police continuing to chase new leads and re-examine old ones. At one point, a woman came forward claiming that on the day Candy disappeared, she had seen a green car following the young girl. Investigators renewed their focus on tracking down that specific vehicle. But the lead went nowhere, and the timing of the witness's statement, coming years after the fact, raised its own set of questions. In the decades that followed, the case was reopened multiple times. Each time, detectives would start again, reviewing files, re-interviewing witnesses, and hoping for a break. But progress was slow and often non-existent. Strangely, the case also drew a wave of false confessions. Over the years, 13 individuals claimed responsibility for Candy's murder. In every instance, investigators determined they were lying. None of them could provide details that weren't already public. Most repeated facts found in newspaper articles, and none revealed anything only the killer would have known. As odd as it may seem, this kind of behavior isn't uncommon in high-profile cases. For reasons still debated by psychologists and law enforcement alike, some people falsely confess to crimes they didn't commit, seeking attention, suffering from delusions, or trying to escape their current circumstances. Meanwhile, the case continued to move from one detective to another. With each transition, new eyes brought renewed hope that someone might finally uncover the truth. But Candy's murder remained one of the most haunting and unsolved cases, not just in Spokane, but across the entire state. Its impact was far-reaching. Before Candy's disappearance, children in Spokane played freely in the streets, explored the woods, and walked to school alone. But after that March evening in 1959, everything changed. Parents grew more cautious, trust gave way to fear, and the city's sense of innocence was never quite the same again. In the early 2000s, the investigation into Candy Rogers' murder was reopened yet again. This time, a new detective took the lead and decided to apply modern forensic technologies that hadn't existed at the time of the original investigation. Thankfully, the Spokane Police Department had done one thing exceptionally well back in 1959. They had carefully preserved all the evidence. That diligence paid off. Forensic experts were able to identify a sample of male semen on Candy's clothing, preserved across decades in storage. Analyzing the degraded sample proved incredibly difficult, but after considerable effort and the use of advanced techniques, scientists managed to extract a DNA profile. The sample was uploaded to the FBI's national database in hopes of finding a match. But no match came back. Undeterred, investigators began the painstaking process of comparing the DNA to profiles from dozens of former suspects. One by one, they were ruled out, including Hugh Morris, the man many had long believed to be Candy's killer. The forensic evidence made it clear he had no connection to the crime. Once again, the case hit a wall. Investigators now had the DNA of the person who had sexually assaulted and murdered Candy Rogers, but no identity to go with it. In 2021, the case was reopened yet again. A new detective stepped in and decided to take a different approach: genetic genealogy, a technique that had revolutionized cold case investigations in recent years. By tracing distant relatives through family tree databases, this method had solved hundreds of cases across the country. There was renewed hope it could finally solve one of Spokane's most enduring mysteries. The detective contacted several specialized laboratories, but there, he faced another crushing setback. To perform genetic genealogy, labs needed to work with the original DNA sample, and by this time, the decades-old semen had degraded significantly. Multiple labs attempted to extract viable data, but each concluded the same thing. The sample was too damaged to process. The breakthrough they had hoped for was, once again, just out of reach. With other labs unable to help, the detective turned to one final laboratory. A last-ditch effort that unexpectedly produced the breakthrough they had been hoping for. Using advanced forensic tools, the experts were finally able to recover enough genetic material from the degraded sample. They extracted a viable DNA profile of the unknown perpetrator. That profile was then uploaded to genealogical databases, initiating a complex search for any distant relatives of the suspect. After painstaking work analyzing thousands of potential matches, investigators were able to narrow the field to one specific family. Within that family, detectives identified 3 brothers as potential sources of the DNA. But there was a new complication. All 3 were deceased. Still, investigators pressed on. They discovered that one of the brothers had a daughter. Police reached out to her and explained what they had found, that her late father might be the man responsible for the murder of Candy Rogers. Shocked and devastated, the woman nonetheless agreed to help. She provided her own DNA, and testing confirmed she was a close relative of the person whose semen had been found on Candy's clothing. Armed with this evidence, detectives obtained a court order to exhume her father's remains. Forensic specialists extracted a DNA profile, and after 62 years, the identity of Candy Rogers' killer was finally revealed. His name was John Hoff. The DNA was a perfect match to the sample collected from Candy's clothing in 1959. Despite hundreds of suspects investigated over the decades, John Hoff had never appeared on law enforcement's radar. But once his identity was confirmed through DNA, detectives turned to his background and uncovered a troubling history. At the time of Candy Rogers' murder, Hoff was 20 years old and living less than a mile from her home. He was serving in the U.S. Army, stationed at a base near the location where Candy's body would later be found. 2 years after the murder, Hoff was arrested for a violent crime. He had bound, sexually assaulted, and attempted to kill a woman, but she survived. For that attack, he was sentenced to just 6 months in prison and was dishonorably discharged from the military. Following his release, Hoff started a new chapter. He married and raised 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters, and appeared to lead a quiet, uneventful life. He held a series of jobs, and at one point, while working in a food packaging plant, he suffered a serious chemical burn to the face, leaving a permanent scar. His life ended in June 1970, 11 years after Candy's murder, when he died by suicide. He left no note. As detectives dug deeper, they discovered that Candy may have known her killer. She had been friends with Hoff's younger sister, who was 10 years old at the time. All these years later, that same sister recalled crying in her brother's arms after learning that her friend had been murdered, never suspecting that he was the one responsible. Tragically, Candy's parents never lived to see the case solved. Her mother passed away in 2006, and her father died by suicide in 1963, just 4 years after her murder. Though the exact reasons remain unknown, many believe he simply could not cope with the grief of losing his only child. After more than 62 years, the Candy Rogers case was officially closed, making it one of the longest-running investigations ever solved. It had passed through generations of detectives and endured decades of dead ends. At the press conference announcing the killer's identity, only one officer who had worked the case back in 1959 was still alive to witness the moment. Standing before cameras, he said simply that he thanked God for allowing him to live long enough to see the truth finally come to light. As for Hoff's daughter, the woman whose DNA helped solve the case, she initially struggled to accept that her father was responsible for such a horrific act. But as the evidence became undeniable, she publicly acknowledged the truth. She called her father a monster who had stolen the life of an innocent child and expressed deep sorrow that he was never held accountable in his lifetime. In an unsettling twist, Hoff had taken his own life at the very moment his daughter turned 9 years old, the same age Candy was when she was killed. Whether that was a coincidence or something more meaningful remains unknown. And perhaps, after all these years, that's one of the many questions we'll never have an answer to. 4. The murder of Angie Hausman, USA, 1993. Angie Hausman was born on February 18, 1984, in St. Louis, Missouri. Her father left before she was born, and she never had the chance to know him. When Angie was just a year old, her mother remarried a man named Ronald, and together they had a son. Angie quickly grew attached to her younger brother, and the two shared a close bond. She was a bright and friendly child, eager to make friends and connect with everyone around her. Angie's family lived in a quiet suburb of St. Louis, the kind of place where neighbors looked out for one another and kids played freely outside. By 1993, Angie was 9 years old and in the 4th grade. She attended an elementary school just over a mile from her home. Each day, she caught the school bus from a nearby stop just a few hundred yards away. Her parents felt comfortable letting her make the short walk alone, especially since she usually traveled with other neighborhood kids. On the way home, a group of parents routinely watched from their windows to make sure the children got back safely. It had become a kind of informal neighborhood system, simple but effective. On November 18th, Angie followed her usual routine. She went to school, finished her day around 3 p.m., and took the bus back to her neighborhood. She got off at her stop with the other kids, and they all started walking home together. As they reached their houses, the group slowly broke up. Angie lived a little farther than the rest, and before long, she was walking alone. It was only a short distance, just a few minutes from where the others left her. But this time, Angie never made it home. About 30 minutes passed before her parents began to worry. Angie was known to stop and chat, but she was never this late. Her mother and stepfather went outside to retrace her route. They asked other neighborhood children if they'd seen her, and they all gave the same answer. Angie had gotten off the bus with them and headed in the direction of her house. Somewhere along that short, familiar walk home, Angie vanished. Angie's parents didn't waste any time. After speaking with a few neighbors, particularly the women who usually kept watch over the kids from their windows, they quickly realized that neither had seen anything that afternoon. Both had been preoccupied that day, leaving a rare gap in the neighborhood's usual sense of security. Worried, Angie's parents and friends sprang into action. They began combing the area between the bus stop and their home, calling out her name and searching nearby yards, alleys, and wooded patches. As daylight faded and evening set in, panic grew. With no sign of Angie, her parents called the police. Officers arrived promptly and joined the search. Given the cold November weather, police doubted Angie had wandered off voluntarily, and they immediately began to consider more troubling possibilities. That concern was amplified by a disturbing incident that had occurred just 10 days earlier in a nearby neighborhood. An 11-year-old girl had nearly been abducted after getting off her school bus. A man had tried to drag her into the bushes, but she escaped. The suspect had never been caught. Now, with Angie missing under eerily similar circumstances, investigators couldn't ignore the possibility that the same predator was behind this case. Police brought in K9 units to aid in the search. The dogs picked up Angie's scent near the bus stop and followed it along the route toward her home. But then, about halfway there, the trail abruptly vanished. This suggested she may have been picked up by someone in a vehicle, reinforcing fears that she had been abducted. Search efforts expanded quickly. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging scanned the area from above, while officers searched the banks of a nearby stream. But by the end of that first day, there were no answers, no sign of Angie, and no trace of her belongings. By the next morning, police turned to the public for help. Local media picked up the story, and within hours, word of Angie's disappearance spread across the city. Tips started pouring in. The department received more than 300 calls in a single day, so many that over 20 additional officers had to be brought in to manage the response. But despite the overwhelming number of leads, none of them brought investigators any closer to finding Angie Houseman. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. In the early days of the investigation, detectives explored every possible scenario, and that included taking a closer look at Angie's stepfather. As is standard in missing child cases, those closest to the victim were scrutinized first. The man insisted he had nothing to do with Angie's disappearance and claimed he would never harm her. Eager to clear his name, he agreed to take a polygraph and undergo any other checks detectives requested. He told investigators he simply wanted them to stop focusing on him and start using their time to find his stepdaughter. Police also tracked down Angie's biological father, and what they learned raised some eyebrows. Though he had never been involved in Angie's life, Her mother claimed he had occasionally driven past their home, watching as Angie played outside. It was a disturbing detail, and detectives initially found it suspicious. But the man had a solid, verifiable alibi, and ultimately, he was ruled out. By the third day of the investigation, the FBI joined the case, and even more local officers were reassigned to assist. Everyone involved understood the grim reality. If Angie had been taken, she would not survive long in the frigid November temperatures. Time was running out. Around this time, police received a promising lead. A tipster reported seeing a suspicious man slowly cruising through Angie's neighborhood in a blue sedan around the time she vanished. The description of the driver bore a striking resemblance to the man who had attempted to abduct an 11-year-old girl just 10 days earlier. Investigators quickly put together a composite sketch, which was shared with the media and distributed widely. Volunteers printed and handed out thousands of flyers across the region. But despite the exposure, the man's identity remained unknown. As media attention grew, Angie's case was picked up by national television, generating an even greater influx of leads. Detectives worked through every tip that came in, but none brought them any closer to finding her. With the case now dominating headlines, psychics began to insert themselves. Several called Angie's home, offering up visions of where she might be. One even insisted the girl was alive and being held in a large national park, 25 miles from the family's home. But the investigators, grounded in hard evidence, chose not to pursue these claims. They knew they needed real leads, not guesses. In an effort to generate more leads, authorities offered a $10,000 reward for any information about Angie's whereabouts. The incentive sparked a fresh wave of tips, but none led to her. Then, investigators uncovered a deeply unsettling detail. Just days before her disappearance, Angie had told one of her teachers that she was planning to go on a nature trip with her uncle. But there was a catch. Angie didn't have an uncle, at least not one known to the family. Her parents were baffled. They had never heard of such a trip, and no relative had mentioned taking her anywhere. This prompted a troubling theory. Perhaps Angie knew her abductor, at least well enough to trust him. Referring to him as uncle could have been a way to explain the relationship, either to herself or to others. Investigators pursued the lead vigorously, but were unable to identify this mysterious figure. For several more days, the investigation stalled. Leads went nowhere. The community remained on edge. But then, on November 27th, 9 days after Angie disappeared, everything changed. A hunter called the police after making a grim discovery in the August A. Bush Memorial Conservation Area, a large national park located just outside of St. Louis. He had found a human body in the woods. When officers arrived, they were met with a horrifying scene. The body of a young girl had been tied to a tree. She was completely unclothed, and her head was tightly wrapped in duct tape, with only her nose left uncovered. Her hands were bound with metal handcuffs. Nearby, investigators found a bag containing personal belongings, including notebooks with the name Angie Houseman written inside. The body was quickly identified and turned over to medical examiners. What they found was even more devastating. Once the tape was removed, examiners discovered a piece of underwear had been stuffed into Angie's mouth. Based on the condition of her body, they determined that she had been kept alive for most of the 9 days she was missing. Incredibly, she had died only hours before her body was found, from exposure. She had frozen to death, alone in the woods. The autopsy also confirmed that Angie had suffered numerous injuries and had been sexually assaulted. The investigation had gone from a frantic search to a brutal reality. Angie hadn't simply vanished. She had endured 9 days of unimaginable suffering, and someone had orchestrated it with chilling precision. Forensic analysts meticulously examined every item recovered from the scene where Angie's body was found. On the duct tape used to bind her head, they made a promising discovery: a single fingerprint. Investigators ran it through criminal databases and compared it to prints from multiple suspects, hoping for a breakthrough. But no match was found. The lead went nowhere. In the aftermath of Angie's death, the St. Louis Police Department intensified its efforts. More resources were dedicated to the case. The brutality of the crime had left the local community shaken. Parents were terrified. Children were no longer allowed to walk alone. Moms and dads waited at bus stops, escorted their kids to school, and kept them within sight at all times. What had once been a safe suburban neighborhood was now gripped by fear. That fear only deepened a few days later. On December 1st, less than 2 weeks after Angie's body was discovered, another child vanished. This time it was 10-year-old Casey, who lived just 10 miles away. That afternoon, Casey had asked her mother if she could go visit friends who lived only a few hundred yards down the street. But she never made it there. She simply disappeared on the short walk to their house. The case was immediately classified as high priority, and police launched a large-scale search. Detectives couldn't ignore the timing or the similarities. 2 young girls, abducted just days apart, within miles of each other. It raised an alarming question. Was there a serial predator at large? Investigators didn't rule out the possibility that the same person was responsible for both abductions. But they had no physical evidence linking the 2 cases. Then, 10 days later, searchers found Casey's body in St. Louis. She had been wrapped in 2 bedsheets and covered with a pink curtain. The autopsy revealed that she had died from multiple blunt force injuries to the head, a violent and direct cause of death. Despite their efforts, detectives found no clues pointing to a suspect, and the differences between the 2 crimes began to stand out. Angie had been held captive, restrained, and tortured before dying of exposure. Casey had been killed swiftly by blunt force trauma. The method, the timeline, and the manner were all distinct. Slowly, detectives began to consider a chilling new theory. These weren't the work of one killer, but 2. 2 predators. 2 girls. 1 city. 1 month. Detectives eventually identified the man who had attempted to abduct an 11-year-old girl just days before Angie Houseman went missing. He was 37-year-old Gary, a man who frequently traveled to St. Louis for work. Investigators immediately looked into whether he could be linked to the murders of Angie or Casey. But Gary had a rock-solid alibi. Records showed he wasn't in the city during the time either girl disappeared. While he wasn't connected to the homicides, Gary did admit to assaulting 4 other girls during his travels. He was ultimately convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Then, in February of the following year, detectives got a long-awaited break in Casey's case. When her body was discovered, officers had noted tire tracks near the scene. Photos of the tracks were sent to forensic experts, who determined that they had been left by a pickup truck commonly used by a well-known car rental company. The truck's branding, bold and easily recognizable, gave detectives a new strategy. They canvassed Casey's neighborhood, asking residents if they had seen a rental pickup in the area around the time of her disappearance. Their efforts paid off. One woman recalled seeing a branded rental pickup parked near her neighbor's home about a week after Casey went missing. Police quickly zeroed in on the address. Inside the home lived a woman with her partner and her brother. When questioned, the woman insisted that no one in the household had rented a pickup and that they had nothing to do with the case. But detectives weren't convinced. They obtained a search warrant, and during their sweep of the home, investigators made a chilling discovery. Blood traces belonging to Casey were found in the basement, along with the murder weapon. Further investigation revealed what the household had failed to disclose. The woman's brother, Thomas, had in fact rented the pickup in question. Confronted with the evidence, Thomas initially denied everything, but under pressure he finally confessed. The case of Casey's murder was now solved, but Angie Hausman's killer was still out there. According to his confession, Thomas claimed that Casey had knocked on his door that day, hoping to invite his nephews outside to play. He told her to come inside and led her to the basement. Once there, he attempted to assault her, but when Casey began to scream, he panicked, striking her with a heavy object. After killing her, he wrapped her body in bedsheets. Remarkably, after the murder, Thomas left for work as if nothing had happened. When he returned later that day, his sister confronted him, saying she had seen Casey's body in the basement. But rather than going to the authorities, she told him she didn't want to know what had happened and demanded he dispose of the body immediately. Terrified by the ongoing search and media attention, Thomas kept Casey's body in the basement for a full week. Once the attention died down, he rented a pickup truck, drove her body to St. Louis, and left it in a remote area. Thomas was eventually arrested, charged, and sentenced to death. But he never lived to see execution. He died in prison from health complications a few years later. When questioned about Angie Hausman's murder, Thomas denied any involvement. With no evidence connecting him to Angie's case, detectives came to believe that the two crimes were unrelated. With that conclusion, the investigation into Angie's murder once again stalled. Months passed with no new leads, and public attention slowly faded. As time went on, detectives faced yet another challenge: the expiration of the initial reward money. There was concern that without a financial incentive, tips from the public would stop altogether. Then, in 2001, an unexpected lifeline arrived. A local businessman stepped forward and donated $250,000 as a reward for information leading to Angie's killer. At the time, it was one of the largest rewards ever offered in the region. The announcement brought a surge of new tips, and for a moment, hope returned. But one by one, each lead was investigated, and each one led nowhere. The trail had gone cold again. The case remained dormant until 2001, when detectives received a surprising phone call from an inmate named Corey Fox. Serving time in prison, Fox confessed to more than 10 murders, among them the killing of Angie Hausman. Eager for answers, detectives rushed to interview him. Fox detailed how he and an accomplice had abducted Angie from the street, keeping her hidden in his home for several days. He claimed their original plan was to demand a ransom, but they ultimately decided to kill her, fearing she could identify them. To the investigators' surprise, Fox described several accurate details, including how Angie was tied to a tree and how her underwear had been used as a gag. He even mentioned her being found with her head wrapped in tape. But soon, inconsistencies emerged. When asked what had been used to restrain her hands, Fox said plastic handcuffs, yet police knew iron ones had been used. Further digging revealed that Fox couldn't have committed several of the other murders he confessed to, casting doubt on his entire story. Detectives concluded he likely fabricated parts of his confession, possibly pulling details from the extensive media coverage of Angie's case over the years. Then, in the summer of 2002, the case gained renewed public attention after a 6-year-old girl was abducted from her home in a different part of St. Louis and murdered. Initially, police considered a connection to Angie's case, but within hours, the neighbor responsible was arrested and confessed to the crime, eliminating any link to Angie's killer. Years passed once more without answers, until 2007, when detectives decided to revisit the case files with fresh eyes. As they combed through the original reports, one small detail stood out. Shortly after Angie's body was discovered, officers had noted a parked vehicle near the crime scene. Inside was a man named Roger Martin. Questioned at the time, Martin told police he was there to hunt, but when they briefly inspected his car, there was no hunting gear in sight. This discovery prompted the newly assigned detective team to dig deeper into Roger Martin's background. What they found was disturbing. Martin had a criminal history involving offenses against children, and chillingly, one of those assaults occurred in the same wooded area where Angie's body had been found. All of these crimes had taken place before Angie's death, and the information was readily available in police databases. Yet for reasons still unclear, investigators at the time had never seriously pursued Roger as a suspect. The new team decided it was time to start from scratch. Roger was brought in for questioning. He flatly denied any connection to Angie's murder, claiming he'd been in the area by coincidence. He insisted that during the time Angie was believed to have been left there, he was at work, though detectives were unable to verify his alibi. After a 9-hour interrogation, police were left with more questions than answers. As part of their renewed investigation, they collected Roger's fingerprints and compared them to the print found on the tape wrapped around Angie's head. The result was definitive: no match. With no physical evidence tying him to the crime, Roger was released. Although detectives didn't officially clear him, they simply didn't have enough to move forward. The case would remain stagnant until 2018, when the St. Louis Police Department created a special task force focused solely on Angie's murder. Armed with modern forensic tools and fresh determination, this team began a full-scale review of the evidence collected in 1993. They zeroed in on 3 critical items: the handcuffs, the tape used to bind Angie's head, and the piece of her underwear used as a gag. Despite repeated attempts over the years, no DNA profile had ever been recovered from these items, but the new team wasn't ready to give up. They believed modern advancements in DNA analysis might finally yield what earlier techniques could not, and they sent the evidence back to the lab for a fresh examination. Investigators began their renewed forensic examination with the handcuffs, hoping to find any trace of foreign DNA. But this proved difficult. The metal was almost entirely coated in Angie's blood, making the recovery of other biological material nearly impossible. Next, they turned their attention to the tape that had been wrapped around Angie's head. But when they opened the evidence box, they were met with disappointment. The tape had degraded badly over time, literally crumbling in their hands, rendering it useless for DNA analysis. With 2 pieces of evidence down, the team shifted to their final option: the piece of Angie's underwear that had been used to gag her. At first glance, this too seemed like a long shot. The fabric had been inside her mouth for hours, and experts feared that any trace of the killer's DNA would have been erased or overwhelmed by Angie's own. Still, they pressed on. Using cutting-edge forensic technology, the lab technicians painstakingly scanned every fiber of the material, and finally, their patience paid off. A minute but viable sample of unknown male DNA was recovered. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The DNA profile was uploaded to the FBI database, and expectations were kept low. In many cold cases, this process leads nowhere. But this time, the results came back immediately and definitively. The DNA was a perfect match to Earl Webster Cox, a 58-year-old man who had been incarcerated since 2003. Cox had never been linked to Angie's case before, but his criminal history was extensive and disturbing. Detectives went to the prison to confront Earl Cox, but as soon as they sat down, he shut them down, denying any involvement and immediately requesting a lawyer. With his DNA already confirmed on the key evidence, investigators knew his chances in court were slim. But instead of banking solely on the forensic match, they chose a different tactic. They reached out to Cox's attorney and laid out their position. If he didn't confess, they'd pursue the death penalty. However, if he admitted to the crime, the prosecution would take capital punishment off the table and instead seek life imprisonment without parole. It didn't take long for Cox to make his decision. Understanding the strength of the case against him, he agreed to the terms. When detectives returned to the prison, he offered a confession, though parts of it didn't quite add up. Still, for the investigators, the most important piece was now secured: a direct admission to Angie's murder. Cox claimed that on November 18, 1993, he happened to be driving near the neighborhood where his mother and sister lived. According to him, his car stalled. While checking under the hood, a school bus stopped nearby, dropping off several children. He claimed all of them went inside, except one, Angie. He said she walked over, and they started talking. Noticing she looked cold, he offered her a ride to warm up, and she supposedly accepted. Cox alleged that he took her to Burger King, bought her food, then brought her back to his home, where he kept her for several days and sexually assaulted her. Eventually, Cox said, he decided to let her go, but instead of returning her home, he drove her to a wooded area, tied her to a tree, and left her there alive. Detectives didn't believe the story, at least not all of it. Angie was just minutes from home when she vanished. It was hard to believe she would willingly get into a stranger's car, especially one who wasn't from the neighborhood. Cox's tale about the broken-down car starting just in time seemed even more suspicious. In all likelihood, he had spotted Angie walking alone and made a deliberate, premeditated decision to abduct her, using deception or force. Regardless, the confession gave prosecutors what they needed. In August 2020, Earl Cox was brought before a judge and formally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But there was a somber absence in the courtroom. Angie's mother had passed away from cancer in 2016, never living to see justice for her daughter. Her husband Ronald told reporters, "Earl Cox should have been convicted of 2 murders. He didn't just kill Angie, he killed my wife too. She never recovered." And Earl's story didn't end with that sentence. Prosecutors reopened a past case involving 2 7-year-old girls who had been sexually abused by Cox, a crime for which he'd previously faced no serious consequences, serving just a year for a parole violation. Detectives contacted one of those victims, now an adult, and asked her to testify. She agreed. Earl, now facing overwhelming evidence and multiple charges, pleaded guilty again. He was handed an additional 10-year sentence. When the judge gave her the opportunity to speak, the victim stood and addressed the court. She said that despite what Cox had done to her as a child, she would live a full, happy life, and he would rot behind bars, exactly where he belonged. 5. The Murder of Rebecca Gould, USA, 2004. Rebecca Gould was born on April the 28th, 1982, in the quiet town of Melbourne, Arkansas. She was one of 4 sisters, and after the youngest was born, their parents separated. The divorce was difficult at first, but the experience drew the sisters closer together. Living with their mother, they leaned on each other for strength, forming a tight-knit bond that only deepened over time. They remained close to their father too, splitting time between homes and maintaining strong family ties. After high school, Rebecca enrolled at Northwest Arkansas Community College in Fayetteville, where one of her sisters was already studying. Sharing a campus meant they could see each other almost daily. Despite their busy schedules, they often made the short 25-mile trip home to visit family. It wasn't always easy to find the time, but they made the effort. In September 2004, 22-year-old Rebecca was preparing for a big transition. She had plans to transfer to the University of Arkansas, but before making the move, she decided to complete one last semester at her current college. Before the new term began, she and her sister decided to head home for the weekend. Rebecca also had plans to see her boyfriend, who lived in a nearby town. After spending Sunday, September 19th, with their family, she left to visit him. The following day, she was supposed to pick up her sister so they could drive back together in her car. But when the time came, Rebecca never showed up. Rebecca's sister tried calling her several times, but each call went unanswered. At first, no one panicked. Rebecca was 22, responsible, and perfectly capable of making her own decisions. Her family figured she might just be catching up on sleep before heading back to college or spending a bit more time with friends. It wasn't out of character. But as the day wore on and still no one heard from her, the unease began to grow. By evening, her family was openly worried. They tried to stay hopeful. Maybe she had simply decided to stay in town for an extra night and would be back the next morning. But when Rebecca failed to show up or call the next day, and none of her friends had seen or heard from her, concern turned to fear. Her mother finally called the police. The investigation began quickly. Officers learned that Rebecca had spent the night at her boyfriend Casey's house and had even dropped him off at work the morning she disappeared, around 8:30 a.m. According to Casey, Rebecca was supposed to return to his house, gather her belongings, and later meet up with her sister for the drive back to Fayetteville. She also promised to pick him up after his shift, but she never came. Casey said he waited for her in the cafe parking lot. When she didn't arrive, he assumed plans had changed and went out with friends to a party. The police noted the timeline and asked if they could search his home. Casey agreed. Outside, Rebecca's car was still parked in the driveway. Inside, officers found her purse, complete with her identification, and her dog, both left behind. Strangely, her small suitcase with clothing was missing. According to Casey, she had it when she arrived, but now it was gone. The situation was becoming more troubling by the minute. Rebecca had vanished, and yet her most important belongings, including her beloved pet, were still at her boyfriend's house. But that wasn't all. One officer took note of something odd. The mattress on the bed was bare and sitting unevenly, as if it had been hastily repositioned. When he lifted it, he discovered large reddish stains underneath, stains that strongly resembled blood. That discovery prompted a more thorough search of the house. Soon, more blood was found, on the floor, smeared along the wallpaper. In the washing machine, investigators found blood-stained bedding, and scattered around the house were multiple bottles of bleach, suggesting someone had made a frantic attempt to clean up. It was an ominous scene. While it was still too early to confirm whether the blood was Rebecca's, DNA results would take several days. Investigators were already considering the grim possibility that she might no longer be alive. As forensic experts processed the home, detectives turned their attention to the person most likely to have last seen Rebecca, her boyfriend, Casey. Given the amount of blood found in his house, he quickly became the focal point of the investigation. Casey, however, denied having anything to do with Rebecca's disappearance. He repeated his earlier account, that she had dropped him off at work the previous morning, and he hadn't seen or heard from her since. He told detectives that after spending the night with friends, he came home to change clothes before his next shift. According to him, he didn't notice any bloodstains in the house. He claimed he didn't smell bleach and didn't think much of Rebecca's car still being in the driveway, or the fact that her dog and purse were still inside. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means a lot to us and helps us grow. A huge thank you to everyone who's been watching. The police weren't quick to take Casey at his word, but at that point, they lacked concrete evidence to directly implicate him in Rebecca's disappearance, or anything more sinister. Still, they followed up on every detail. Detectives tracked down the friends Casey claimed to have spent Monday night with, and each of them confirmed his story. He had in fact been with them until the next morning. With a seemingly solid alibi in place, investigators shifted their focus and widened the search. Despite their efforts, the timeline remained murky. Rebecca hadn't answered any calls since early Monday morning, but the exact moment of her disappearance was still unclear. During questioning, Casey suggested detectives look into someone else, Rebecca's ex-boyfriend, a man named Justin. Police attempted to reach him, but he wasn't at home and didn't answer his phone. The timing was concerning. He'd seemingly gone off the radar at the same time his ex-girlfriend vanished. 2 days later, Justin finally resurfaced. He told police he had been at a casino with his father. Investigators verified his story, and the alibi checked out. He had been out of town the entire time. Then, detectives caught a break. In reconstructing Rebecca's movements on the day she vanished, they discovered she had stopped at a gas station not far from Casey's workplace. Surveillance footage and employee testimony confirmed she had come in around 8:30 a.m., bought a breakfast sandwich, and left, consistent with Casey's version of events. The detail that stood out most: the same sandwich, uneaten, was later found sitting in Casey's house. It was a small but telling clue, one that confirmed Rebecca made it back to the house that morning. Whatever happened to her happened shortly after she walked through that door. Given that Casey was already at work around the time Rebecca was believed to have returned to the house, detectives began to reconsider his role in the case. His alibi, once in doubt, now seemed more credible. Then came the blood analysis results. The stains found throughout Casey's home, on the mattress, walls, floor, and bedding, were confirmed to be Rebecca's. No foreign DNA was detected. While this didn't point to a specific suspect, it reinforced the belief that something violent had happened inside that house. Investigators pressed forward, conducting a wide sweep of interviews with Rebecca's relatives, close friends, and acquaintances. They considered the possibility that her attacker may have been someone familiar, someone with a personal motive. Detectives also turned their attention to Casey's circle, wondering if someone close to him might have had access to his home. But every lead came up short. Then, on September 27th, 1 week after Rebecca vanished, the case took a grim turn. Her body was discovered approximately 12 miles from Casey's home, at the bottom of an embankment off a quiet stretch of highway. The location was isolated and hidden from the road, making it unlikely that anyone would have found her by chance. Even more disturbing was how her body had been left, fully exposed, not concealed in any way. It appeared the killer had simply driven to the site, discarded her body, and left without a second thought. The autopsy revealed the extent of the violence. Rebecca had suffered multiple blows to the head with a heavy object, but the official cause of death was strangulation. There were no signs of defensive wounds, suggesting she may have been ambushed. The attack sudden and overwhelming. Medical examiners also found no evidence of sexual assault. As for the time of death, forensic examiners estimated that Rebecca's body had likely been lying at the bottom of the embankment for about a week. But beyond that, they couldn't pinpoint the moment she died with any precision. Back at Casey's house, detectives believed they had identified a possible murder weapon. A piano was missing one of its heavy, solid legs. Medical experts examined the shape and weight of the remaining legs and confirmed they were consistent with the blunt force injuries found on Rebecca's head. Casey told investigators that the missing leg had been loose for a while and could have come off easily. But when police searched both the house and the area where Rebecca's body was found, the leg was nowhere to be seen. Whether it had been hidden, disposed of, or taken as some kind of trophy remained unknown. With little physical evidence to guide them, investigators turned their attention to motive. A robbery was quickly ruled out. Nothing in the house appeared to be stolen, except for the piano leg and Rebecca's suitcase. Sexual assault was also ruled out, which left detectives with one grim possibility. The killer may have acted with the sole intention of ending Rebecca's life. Given that she appeared to have been killed soon after returning to Casey's house, detectives speculated the perpetrator may have known her schedule and known she would be alone that morning. That suggested premeditation. Just as troubling was the lack of forced entry. Police found no broken locks or signs of a struggle at the door. Rebecca may have let her killer inside, someone she trusted. Investigators believed the killer had spent several hours inside the house after the murder, desperately trying to scrub away the blood with bleach. Once the cleanup was complete, or at least as complete as they could manage, the perpetrator likely carried Rebecca's body to her own car and drove it to the remote embankment where it was later found. Despite these grim details, detectives were left with virtually no solid evidence. The investigation stalled. Police cast a wide net, considering hundreds of potential suspects, everyone from Rebecca and Casey's acquaintances to extended family members, neighbors, and even residents of nearby towns. But no connection, no motive, no clue emerged. The department was flooded with tips, yet none led anywhere. Many calls were based solely on suspicion, finger-pointing without substance. After months of chasing down fruitless leads, the case slowly went cold. Although investigators never gave up entirely, their efforts yielded no meaningful progress. Over the years, the case was reopened multiple times, passed between new teams of detectives, each hopeful they might succeed where others had failed. But time and again, the trail led nowhere. Part of what made this case so difficult was the lack of an apparent motive. Without understanding why someone would want to kill Rebecca, figuring out who might have done it became all the more complicated. Eventually, the mystery surrounding her death drew the attention of the true crime community. The case was featured in television programs and podcasts, sparking renewed public interest. One person who remained especially committed was journalist George Jared. He had followed the case since the very beginning, publishing a book, launching a podcast, and dedicating years of his life to finding out who killed Rebecca Gould. At some point in their independent investigation, George Jared crossed paths with Jennifer Colts. a former U.S. Army counterintelligence officer who had also taken an interest in Rebecca's case. The two decided to team up, combining their investigative instincts and experience. Together, they launched a Facebook group dedicated to the case, inviting public discussion and sharing theories with fellow true crime enthusiasts. It didn't take long for one particular member to stand out. A man named William Miller quickly became one of the group's most active participants. At first, it was his location that raised eyebrows. Miller lived in the Philippines. His intense interest in an unsolved murder from a small town in Arkansas, thousands of miles away, seemed unusual. But what really caught their attention was his behavior. Miller flooded the group with comments, offered intricate theories, and even messaged the admins privately. He wasn't just invested, he was fixated. He discussed obscure details with surprising precision, offering insights into specific moments of the investigation. Even more unsettling, he showed an uncanny familiarity with the geography surrounding the crime scene. George and Jennifer took notice. Though suspicious, they kept their doubts to themselves, fearing that confronting him too soon might scare him off. Instead, they continued engaging him, hoping to learn more. Then came a breakthrough, thanks to another group member, an amateur genealogist who decided to dig a little deeper into Miller's background. Using public information from his Facebook profile, she unearthed something that stunned the team. William Miller was a cousin of Casey, Rebecca's boyfriend, and the last person known to have seen her alive. After uncovering William Miller's family connection to the case, George and Jennifer decided it was time to involve law enforcement. They reached out to the detectives handling Rebecca's case and shared their growing suspicions about Miller's unusual interest and online behavior. When investigators revisited the case files, they were surprised to find that Miller's name had been there all along. Back in 2004, he had been briefly questioned. At the time, Miller said he had traveled from Texas to assist another relative and admitted to visiting Casey twice, once 2 days before Rebecca's disappearance and again the following day. During that second visit, he never went inside the house. According to Casey's original statement, Rebecca had noticed someone standing outside the window. It was Miller. Casey stepped outside, spoke with his cousin for about 15 minutes, and then Miller left. At the time, the encounter seemed insignificant and didn't raise any red flags. Now, with fresh eyes and new context, detectives saw things differently. They began looking more closely into Miller's background, and what they found was troubling. He had previously been a suspect in several criminal investigations. In 2002, he faced accusations of assaulting a minor. Later, he was arrested for breaking into his ex-wife's home and attacking her. Despite the serious nature of the charges, he had never been convicted in either case. Eventually, Miller left the country, moving to the Philippines, where he married, had children, and worked offshore oil jobs. Detectives wanted to bring him in for further questioning. But with Miller living overseas, they had no legal means to compel his return. Communication with him proved impossible, and the case stalled once again. That changed in 2020, when a notification from U.S. Customs landed on investigators' desks. William Miller was back. He had returned from the Philippines and was now staying in Oregon, where his mother lived. When detectives contacted Miller's mother, she claimed she hadn't seen her son in quite some time, but investigators already knew he was in town, and that she was lying. Sensing an opportunity, they decided to confront Miller directly and bring him in for questioning. At that point, they had no physical evidence linking him to Rebecca's murder. If there was any chance of closing this case, they'd need a confession, and they knew it wouldn't come easy. So they crafted a strategy. Detective Mike McNeil, who was now leading the investigation, approached the interview casually. He told Miller it was a routine follow-up, part of the department's renewed effort to re-interview everyone involved in the original case. Miller didn't hesitate. He said he had nothing to hide and was happy to cooperate. That's when McNeil asked if he'd be willing to take a polygraph test back in Arkansas. Miller agreed, but the moment the detective picked up the phone and pretended to call the local police chief to arrange the test, his demeanor shifted. Miller suddenly grew tense and tried steering the conversation in a different direction. Unbeknownst to him, the polygraph specialist wasn't being called in. He was already waiting in the next room. Detectives weren't relying on the polygraph for courtroom evidence. They knew its results wouldn't hold up in trial. But that wasn't the point. This was a pressure tactic, designed to throw Miller off balance and hopefully break through his defenses. And it worked. Miller hesitated, then asked if polygraph results were admissible in court. Detective McNeil gave a deliberately vague response, saying that under certain circumstances they could be, carefully avoiding just how rare and limited those scenarios actually were. Visibly anxious, Miller agreed to the test. When it was over, the results were clear. He had failed. The polygraph operator concluded that Miller had been deceptive when answering all of the key questions, especially those related to Rebecca's murder. That's when McNeil shifted gears. He told Miller that forensic experts had recently reanalyzed evidence from the original investigation, and that Rebecca's DNA had been discovered in Miller's car. It wasn't true. Back in 2004, investigators had searched Miller's vehicle and found nothing. They hadn't even taken samples for testing. But in an interrogation room, officers are legally allowed to lie in order to elicit a confession. And McNeil knew this might be his best shot. Hearing this, Miller went quiet. The detective pressed harder, repeating that the evidence was conclusive, and the only thing Miller could control now was whether he wanted to cooperate. Then came a shift. Miller finally spoke, but not with a confession. Instead, he spun a new story. He claimed that he had arrived at his cousin's house that morning and found an unknown man in a mask standing over Rebecca's lifeless body. He said he panicked and fled, denying any responsibility. Detective McNeil didn't buy it. He kept pushing, dismantling Miller's story piece by piece. Finally, Miller stopped talking. He sat in silence for a long moment. Then, out of nowhere, he looked up and said, "I'm just going to tell you, I did it. I'm sorry for what I did." According to Miller, the morning of the murder began with a hunting trip in the woods near his cousin Casey's house. As he approached the property, he remembered that Casey's girlfriend Rebecca was staying there. For reasons he couldn't clearly explain, he said he decided to stop by and talk to her. He knocked on the door and told Rebecca he needed to use the phone. She let him in without hesitation. While she returned to the bedroom, Miller pretended to make a call, pacing the living room. Then, he claimed, something in him snapped. Miller described being overcome by an uncontrollable rage, a sudden and inexplicable urge to kill. He grabbed a leg from the piano, walked to the bedroom, and attacked. Rebecca was lying on the bed when he struck her multiple times in the head. Then he strangled her until she stopped breathing. After the murder, Miller wrapped her body in a sheet, carried it to his pickup truck, and attempted to clean the crime scene. He used bleach to wipe blood from the walls, floor, and bedding. Then he drove to a nearby highway and dumped her body beneath an embankment, a secluded spot he knew well from his school days in the area. When the detective asked him why he did it, Miller offered no concrete explanation. He simply said he had an urge to kill and couldn't stop himself. He ended the interview by saying he had lived with regret for years and was ready to accept responsibility for what he'd done. Following his confession, Miller was arrested and extradited to Arkansas to face charges. But once in custody, he abruptly changed course, recanting everything and insisting he was innocent. That sudden reversal put the case in jeopardy, casting doubt on whether his confession would hold up in court. By law, a confession must be made before a judge to be legally binding, especially in cases where there's no physical evidence tying a suspect to the crime. In Miller's case, there was yet another complication. During his arrest, the officer reading him his Miranda rights was interrupted mid-sentence when Miller asked a question, leaving the warning incomplete. That procedural misstep, combined with the lack of hard evidence, could have easily jeopardized the entire case. It opened the door to the possibility that Miller's confession might be thrown out, and that he could walk free. But the judge ultimately ruled the confession admissible. Miller had opportunity. He was in town at the time of the murder, knew his cousin's work schedule, and his account of the crime matched critical details investigators had never released to the public. Ironically, Miller had a straightforward path to escape justice. When detectives contacted him in Oregon, he could have declined to cooperate or simply walked out of the station. There was nothing legally holding him there. With no forensic evidence or warrant, he could have caught the next flight back to the Philippines, vanishing beyond the reach of U.S. authorities. Without evidence to support extradition, the case likely would have remained unsolved. Yet Detective McNeil believed Miller never intended to flee. His online activity told a different story. The frequent messages to admins, detailed theories, and unsolicited commentary all pointed to a man who wasn't hiding, but rather circling the truth. If Miller truly wanted to distance himself from the case, he could have stayed silent. Instead, he inserted himself into the narrative, and when finally confronted, he didn't ask for a lawyer or try to walk away. McNeil suspected there was a reason. Miller had been carrying the weight of his guilt for years, and when the moment came, he simply couldn't hold it in any longer. Despite initially retracting his confession, William Miller ultimately changed course and struck a plea deal with prosecutors. In 2022, he formally admitted to the murder of Rebecca Gould and was sentenced to 40 years in prison. But the story didn't end there. While behind bars, Miller made a chilling claim. He confessed to killing 5 additional women over the course of his life. He couldn't provide their names and said he didn't know them. According to Miller, he would pick up women who fit a specific profile, young, petite, slim, with light-colored hair, lure them into his vehicle, drive them to remote areas, and kill them. To detectives, the description was eerily familiar. Rebecca matched his so-called type almost exactly. If Miller was telling the truth, it cast new light on Rebecca's murder. Perhaps she wasn't killed because of a personal conflict or family connection. Perhaps she was targeted simply because she fit his pattern. His decades-long work on oil rigs had taken him across various states, making it plausible that he could have committed these crimes in different jurisdictions without raising suspicion. So far, law enforcement hasn't found evidence to support his claims, but investigations are still underway. Even so, not everyone is convinced by Miller's confession. To this day, some people question whether he truly killed Rebecca. They argue that someone without a clear motive, especially a relative, couldn't have committed such a brutal crime. Some point the finger at Rebecca's boyfriend, speculating that Miller may have helped cover up the murder rather than carry it out himself. Others believe Miller invented the claims about additional victims to gain attention or manipulate the system. But without any hard evidence to support these theories, Miller remains the sole person held responsible for Rebecca's murder in the eyes of the law. Whether he is also a serial killer or simply a man trying to inflate his crimes is a question that remains unanswered as the investigation continues. 6. The kidnapping and murder of Kirsten Hatfield, USA, 1997. Kirsten Hatfield was born on February 12, 1989, in the quiet suburb of Midwest City, Oklahoma. Not long after her birth, her father left the family. Her mother, Shannon, moved back into her parents' home, where she received support raising the infant. When Kirsten turned 2, Shannon and her daughter moved into a place of their own. In time, Shannon remarried and gave birth to a second daughter, Faith. But that marriage also ended, and once again, she found herself raising her children alone. Even at a young age, Kirsten stepped up to help. She became a dependable big sister to Faith, and the two developed a close bond. They shared a bedroom while Shannon slept in the adjacent room. On the evening of May 13, 1997, when Kirsten was 8 and Faith was 3, Shannon followed their usual bedtime routine. Normally, she would read to them, but that night Faith had already drifted off, and Shannon didn't want to disturb her. She kissed Kirsten goodnight, left the door slightly ajar, as she always did, and went to her own room. Around 3 a.m., Shannon was startled awake by a noise coming from the girls' room. Assuming one of them had simply stirred, she got up to check. But as she reached the hallway and neared their door, the sound abruptly stopped. Assuming the noise had simply been the girls shifting in their sleep, Shannon turned to head back to her room. But something gave her pause. The door to the girls' bedroom was now completely shut. That struck her as odd. She always left it slightly ajar, a habit she never broke. Maybe one of the girls had closed it, or perhaps she'd forgotten to leave it open. Either way, she gently pushed it open a crack, peered inside, and saw nothing alarming. She didn't step in. Still thinking everything was fine, she returned to bed. The next morning, around 6:30 a.m., Shannon got up to wake her daughters, but when she entered their bedroom, only 3-year-old Faith was there, still sleeping peacefully. Kirsten's bed was empty. Shannon woke Faith and asked where her sister was, but the little girl had no idea. Panic set in instantly. Shannon searched the house top to bottom, every room, every closet. She stepped outside, called out Kirsten's name, then began phoning friends and neighbors, hoping her daughter had gone off early to play. No one had seen her. As a last resort, she called Kirsten's father, praying her daughter might have gone to him somehow. But he hadn't seen her either. It was clear now. Kirsten had vanished. Her father urged Shannon to call the police immediately. Within minutes, officers arrived at the scene. At first, investigators hoped Kirsten had simply wandered off or was hiding somewhere nearby. After all, Midwest City was a quiet town. The idea that a child could be abducted from her own bedroom was almost unthinkable. Local police had never dealt with anything like it. But those hopes quickly faded. As officers examined Kirsten's room, they noticed something unsettling. The window was slightly open, and on the frame were a few small drops of blood. They stepped outside to examine the ground below. Just a few yards from the window, they found a piece of children's underwear, blood-stained. Officers brought it to Shannon, who confirmed it belonged to her daughter. At that moment, it became clear this wasn't a case of a child sneaking out or getting lost. Kirsten had been taken. The tone of the investigation shifted instantly. More officers were dispatched to the scene, and a perimeter was established. As they combed the area behind the house and surrounding yards, detectives sat down with Shannon to walk through every detail of the night before. That's when she remembered waking at 3 a.m. to an odd noise, a moment that now took on chilling new meaning. It was likely the exact time someone had entered her home and taken Kirsten. Door-to-door interviews began, but no one had seen anything. No strange cars, no suspicious figures. The only clue came from one neighbor who recalled waking up around 3 a.m. to a dog barking, a detail that now seemed far more significant. With no solid leads to follow, investigators brought in a child psychologist to speak with Faith, Kirsten's 3-year-old sister. Though still very young, Faith revealed something crucial. She had seen what happened that night. But when asked to describe it, she could only repeat a single haunting phrase. "A bad person came and took my sister." It was a chilling confirmation. Kirsten had not slipped away on her own. She had been taken. But beyond that, Faith's memory, clouded by her age, offered no further detail. The case was still a mystery. With few clues to go on, detectives were forced to go back to square one. They began to consider the possibility that the abductor wasn't a stranger, but someone Kirsten knew. It seemed unlikely that an outsider could enter the home, snatch a child from her bed, and escape without waking anyone, unless the child trusted them. As they dug deeper, investigators uncovered something that raised red flags. Shannon, Kirsten's mother, had a past involving drug-related issues. This opened up a disturbing theory that Kirsten's disappearance might be linked to her mother's past. Perhaps Shannon owed someone money, and this was their way of collecting. The darker theory was even harder to stomach, that Shannon may have willingly handed over her daughter. It would explain the silence that surrounded the abduction, the lack of a struggle, and why nothing seemed out of place until the next morning. Shannon, however, denied any involvement. She told police she had been clean for some time and insisted she would never harm or give up her child. Detectives listened carefully, but didn't immediately rule her out. Still, despite their suspicions, they couldn't find a single piece of concrete evidence linking her to the abduction. With the case growing colder by the day, investigators turned to the public for help. Through a wave of media appeals, they urged anyone with even the smallest detail to come forward. The response was overwhelming. In the days that followed, the police were flooded with tips. Hundreds of calls poured in, each one meticulously followed up by detectives desperate for a breakthrough. Most leads proved unhelpful. Vague observations, secondhand rumors, or well-meaning guesses. But then, one call stood out. A woman phoned in with a disturbing claim. She suspected her boyfriend might have been involved in Kirsten Hatfield's disappearance. She told detectives he had grown increasingly aggressive and erratic. During a heated argument, he'd made a chilling remark, warning her that if she didn't do as he said, he'd do to her what he did to Kirsten. That statement alone was enough to catch the detectives' full attention. As they dug into his background, more red flags surfaced. The man was acquainted with Shannon's brother, a connection that meant Kirsten could have known him. More than that, the house Shannon and her daughters lived in once belonged to her brother, suggesting this suspect might have been familiar with its layout. His criminal record was troubling, past arrests for drug offenses and even assault. On the surface, everything pointed to him. But the lead unraveled quickly. The man claimed he'd been at a bar the night Kirsten vanished. Police verified the alibi, and multiple witnesses placed him there until 4 a.m., making it impossible for him to have taken the girl. It was a crushing disappointment. And as the weeks wore on, detectives continued chasing down every tip that came in. One by one, each lead collapsed into another dead end. As the months slipped by, the search for Kirsten dragged on with no resolution in sight. With each passing day, the hope of finding her alive grew dimmer. But for her mother, Shannon, surrender was never an option. From the very beginning, Shannon did everything she could to find her daughter. She appeared on local television, handed out flyers, and even investigated potential suspects herself. While police continued to chase down fruitless leads, Shannon worked relentlessly on her own, driven by the kind of determination only a grieving mother could sustain. Still, her efforts were met with constant obstacles. Hoping to broaden awareness, she approached local businesses and asked them to display flyers about Kirsten. But instead of support, she was met with rejection, many citing company policy as the reason for refusing to help. She also tried to secure a meeting with the state governor, hoping it might draw more attention to the case. That request was denied too. Undeterred, Shannon founded a small volunteer center, focusing on flyer distribution and media outreach. But even there, new challenges emerged. Some volunteers misused the platform, stealing donated money, fabricating efforts, and using media coverage to serve their own interests. Still, Shannon pressed on. Eventually, she came to a stark realization. The system she was counting on wasn't delivering answers. So she decided to take matters into her own hands, in a completely different way. Shannon enrolled in college, earned a degree in criminology, and became a parole officer. If no one else could find justice for Kirsten, she was determined to become someone who could. Shannon didn't just become a parole officer to chase justice for her daughter. She also wanted to prevent others from falling victim to the kind of predator who had taken Kirsten. Deep down, she was convinced that whoever abducted her daughter had a criminal past, perhaps someone already known to the system. She pored over case files, studying offenders in her area with violent histories, looking for even the faintest connection to the crime that changed her life. But no matter how diligently she searched, nothing ever led to a breakthrough. Eventually, Shannon was forced to confront a devastating possibility. Kirsten might never come home. Though the pain of that realization was immense, she never truly gave up. Her pursuit of answers never ended. It just evolved. Over the years, police continued to revisit the case, occasionally chasing new leads. None went anywhere. Even with the FBI's assistance, efforts to generate new public interest, including age-progressed sketches of what Kirsten might look like years after her disappearance, didn't bring them closer to the truth. Many had quietly accepted that Kirsten was no longer alive, though without a body, no one could say for sure. Then, in 2014, nearly 2 decades after Kirsten vanished, the case took an unexpected and chilling turn. A woman contacted police with a strange and unsettling story. After her grandmother passed away, she'd been going through the older woman's belongings when she stumbled upon a diary. Inside, her grandmother had written something horrifying. Years earlier, her own son had confessed to killing Kirsten Hatfield. The contents of the diary were so detailed, so specific, that detectives had little doubt about its authenticity. Page after page laid out a harrowing account. The writer's son had abducted Kirsten from her bedroom and taken her to a house he owned in a nearby town. There, according to the entries, he subjected the young girl to unspeakable abuse before brutally killing her. The description of the crime was graphic and extensive, leaving even veteran investigators shaken. The most disturbing detail, however, was a chilling revelation. The man had allegedly recorded the entire ordeal on videotape. Detectives quickly brought the man in for questioning. They expected the usual denials, but what he said stunned them. He insisted he had nothing to do with the abduction or murder, but claimed he knew who did it. According to him, the killing took place not in his house, but in his ex-girlfriend's home. Confused but intrigued, investigators pressed for the address. Armed with a search warrant, forensic teams descended on the property. One of the first steps was to spray luminol, a chemical that glows when it comes into contact with trace amounts of blood, even if it's been scrubbed away. As the blue glow began to emerge, investigators were floored. One forensic specialist would later describe the reaction as lighting up like a Christmas tree. Blood traces were everywhere, across walls, floors, and fixtures. Even more telling, the distribution of the bloodstains mirrored the details described in the diary. The crime scene, once wiped clean, had silently preserved the truth, and now it was finally revealing it. Forensic specialists began a meticulous examination of the property. They removed floorboards, sliced through wallpaper, and gathered every potentially relevant material to send to the lab. Outside, a separate team launched an excavation effort, digging across the yard in the hopes of finally recovering Kirsten's remains. Inside the house, detectives uncovered a box filled with hundreds of old VHS tapes. The discovery immediately brought to mind the haunting detail from the diary, that the killer had filmed the crime. Investigators braced themselves for the grim task ahead, reviewing every single cassette, hour after hour, in search of evidence. But as the days wore on, it became clear that none of the tapes contained anything related to the abduction or murder. There was no footage of Kirsten. The excavation efforts also came up empty. Despite days of digging, no remains were found. And then came the most jarring revelation of all. Lab results from the blood samples found throughout the house returned, and the analysis showed the blood wasn't human. It belonged to an animal. For detectives, it was a gut punch. They had been certain this lead would break the case wide open. Instead, what had seemed like a major breakthrough dissolved into yet another dead end. The truth behind the diary remains a mystery. Was it a cruel hoax? The work of a disturbed mind who had internalized the story of Kirsten's abduction and blurred it with delusions? Investigators couldn't say for sure. All they could do was continue searching, clinging to the hope that one day they'd finally uncover the truth behind Kirsten Hatfield's disappearance. Despite years of investigation, no new leads surfaced, and Kirsten's case faded once again into silence. But in the summer of 2015, a new detective, Daryl Miller, took over. Determined to approach the case with fresh eyes, he pored over every report, every photo, and every scrap of information collected over nearly 2 decades. That's when he noticed something odd and troubling. Buried in the evidence logs were 2 items that had never been fully analyzed: blood found on the windowsill of Kirsten's bedroom and a small stain on her underwear. For reasons that remain unclear, those samples had been preserved but never sent to a lab. Perhaps investigators at the time assumed the blood was Kirsten's and didn't see a need to test it. Detective Miller wasn't willing to make the same assumption. He immediately ordered both samples to be analyzed. When the call from the lab came, the results stunned him. The blood didn't belong to Kirsten. Both samples came from an unknown male. After nearly 18 years, they had a real piece of the puzzle. It was the breakthrough they'd been waiting for. The DNA profile was uploaded to the FBI's national database. But just as quickly as hope surged, it stalled again. There were no matches. The man behind the abduction had never been arrested for a crime serious enough to require a DNA sample, or perhaps his offenses predated the system's implementation. Still, Detective Miller knew one thing for certain. He now had the abductor's genetic fingerprint, and he wasn't going to let it go to waste. Detective Miller wasn't ready to give up. With no match in the national DNA database, he turned to a more painstaking strategy: collecting DNA samples from every man who had been even remotely involved in the case over the years. One by one, the police tracked them down, requesting voluntary DNA submissions. To Miller's surprise, every single person complied without hesitation. That cooperation led investigators to a chilling realization. Perhaps the man they were looking for had never drawn suspicion in the first place. Then the call came. The lab had processed one of the samples. It was a perfect match. The DNA found on Kirsten's windowsill and underwear belonged to 56-year-old Anthony Palma, a neighbor who had lived just across the street from the Hatfields at the time of the abduction. He hadn't been a stranger. Palma was actually one of the very first people questioned after Kirsten disappeared. Back then, he told police he'd been awakened around 3 a.m. by his dog barking, a detail that had seemed innocuous at the time. Now, with the forensic match in hand, detectives paid him another visit. The DNA evidence alone would be more than enough to secure a conviction in court. But for investigators, a confession was still crucial. Not only would it streamline the legal process, it could finally lead them to Kirsten's remains. After all these years, only Palma knew where her body was, and without his cooperation, that final piece of the puzzle could remain lost forever. Detectives knew they had to tread carefully. They invited Anthony Palma in under the guise of a routine follow-up, part of a broader effort, they claimed, to re-interview neighbors in hopes of uncovering overlooked details. But their real goal was far more specific. They wanted to see if Palma would admit to ever being inside the Hatfield home. At first, the conversation felt familiar. Palma repeated the same account he'd given nearly 2 decades earlier, that he'd been woken around 3 a.m. by his barking dog. But this time, he added something new. He said he remembered seeing a white car parked in front of the Hatfield residence that night. At the time, he claimed, it didn't strike him as unusual. The detectives shifted gears, asking about his relationship with the family. Palma described them as neighbors, nothing more. He insisted he never had any direct interaction with Kirsten. He did, however, mention that other neighborhood kids would occasionally stop by, asking him to fix their bikes or offering a friendly hello in exchange for candy. Then came the pivotal question. Had he ever been inside the Hatfield home? Maybe to lend a hand? Visit with Shannon, Kirsten's mother? Palma didn't hesitate. No, he said. Not once. Not while the family lived there. To the detectives, it was the moment they'd been waiting for. They already had his DNA. Blood left on the windowsill of Kirsten's bedroom. And now he had just denied ever stepping foot inside the house. He wasn't just a suspect anymore. He was a liar. And they had the proof. The discovery of Anthony Palma's DNA on the windowsill and on Kirsten's underwear gave detectives critical leverage. It ruled out any innocent explanation, like a casual visit or prior entry, especially since he had just claimed he'd never been inside the Hatfield home. However, there was one complication. The house had once belonged to a friend of Palma's, and he admitted to visiting it during those earlier years. But detectives remained confident. The blood on the windowsill wasn't old. It appeared fresh at the time of the abduction, far too recent to be explained by a years-old visit. They decided it was time to confront him directly. Investigators informed Palma that his blood had been recovered from both Kirsten's bedroom and her underwear. He flatly denied it. Repeating the same line over and over, He insisted again that he had never entered the house. Detectives pressed harder, hoping for a crack in his story. But Palma didn't budge. They shifted strategies. The original investigators stepped out, and Detective Miller entered the room with a photograph of Kirsten in hand. He placed it gently on the table in front of Palma. Without a word, Palma recoiled, quickly pushing the photo away and avoiding eye contact with it for the rest of the interview. Miller kept asking questions, probing for any inconsistency, any slip, but Palma stayed firm in his denials. Eventually, detectives realized the interrogation wasn't going to yield a confession. The evidence, however, was damning. They placed Palma under arrest. With the arrest secured, police obtained a warrant to search his home. A team thoroughly excavated the property, looking for any sign of Kirsten or clues that might point to her fate. But the search turned up nothing. No remains, no physical evidence, just silence and more questions. At trial, Anthony Palma stuck to his story, continuing to deny any involvement in Kirsten Hatfield's disappearance. But the DNA evidence was damning. It left little room for doubt. As proceedings unfolded, the court heard disturbing details that had gone unnoticed during the original investigation. Years before Kirsten vanished, Palma had broken into another girl's bedroom and assaulted her. Even earlier, in the 1980s, he had served time for a violent offense involving a weapon. Despite his troubling history, none of this had been thoroughly examined by police back in 1997, a missed opportunity that may have cost precious time in solving the case. In late 2017, a jury found Palma guilty of kidnapping and murdering Kirsten Hatfield. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Yet even with a conviction secured, Palma never revealed where Kirsten's body was hidden. Investigators came to believe they might never recover her remains. Given his previous work with Park Services, Palma had extensive knowledge of remote wooded areas, places where someone could hide a body so well it might never be found. Still, Kirsten's mother refused to give up. Desperate for closure, she took the extraordinary step of contacting Palma directly. She called him, visited him in prison, and spent hours trying to break through his silence. At times, she believed he was on the verge of telling her the truth, but he never did. Then, in early 2019, the story took one final grim turn. Anthony Palma was killed by his cellmate, a fellow inmate reportedly enraged by Palma's crimes against a child. With his death, the Hatfield family's last chance of learning where Kirsten is buried faded away. Now their only remaining hope lies in the possibility that someone, a hiker, a hunter, a traveler, might one day stumble upon her remains in the wilderness. Until then, the truth rests in silence.